Welcome, sleepy traveler. Tonight, we set sail on a calm, quiet journey, guided by the soft whisper of the wind and the rhythmic rocking of the sea. We are going to drift through the history of an empire that once spanned every time zone on Earth at its height. It was the largest empire in human history, covering nearly a quarter of the world's land and ruling over hundreds of millions. Yet tonight, all those sprawling territories, deep harbors, and bustling trade routes fade into a quiet, gentle mist. As the night wraps around you, we will trace this vast history through 100 calm, steady facts. There is nothing you need to remember. Just let the steady rhythm of the words carry you deeper into quiet stillness. Our first step takes us back to the early days of English seafaring. In the late 15th century, King Henry VII wanted new trade routes. In 1497, he commissioned an Italian explorer named John Cabot to sail under the English flag. Cabot set off from the quiet harbor of Bristol on a small ship called the Matthew Play. He sailed across the vast, cold North Atlantic. Guided by the stars and the steady creak of the wooden hull, he made landfall on the coast of North America, likely around Newfoundland. Though he did not find spices, Cabot found waters so thick with cod that sailors claimed they could scoop them up in baskets. This quiet, cold northern sea became the very first anchor point for England's overseas ambitions, a silent prelude to centuries of expansion. As the years drifted by, the English crown realized building an empire required more than just royal ships. It required a new kind of organization. England began granting royal charters to joint stock companies, allowing private merchants to pool money and share the risks of long-distance voyages. The most powerful was the East India Company, established by a charter from Queen Elizabeth I on the final day of 1600. It grew into a powerful force that eventually ruled vast parts of India with its own private armies. Another early enterprise was the Virginia Company, chartered in 1606 to establish settlements in North America. These companies operated like quiet, corporate states, slowly weaving trade networks across oceans and laying the groundwork for imperial control. The first permanent English settlement was established in a quiet, marshy corner of Virginia in May 1607. 3 small ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, carried just over 100 men to the banks of the James River. They named their outpost Jamestown. The early years were incredibly difficult, marked by hunger, disease, and bitter winters. But the survival of the colony was eventually secured by a quiet green plant, tobacco. John Rolfe introduced a sweet strain of Spanish tobacco, and soon the leaves were growing in every garden of the settlement. The sweet, heavy scent of curing tobacco filled the air, anchoring England's permanent presence in the New World. Further north, in September 1620, the Mayflower left Plymouth, carrying over 100 passengers known as the Pilgrims. They braved 66 days of rough autumn waves, seeking a place to practice their faith in peace, far from the English crown. They finally dropped anchor in the cold, quiet waters of Cape Cod, establishing Plymouth Colony. Over the next decades, tens of thousands of English Puritans crossed the Atlantic in what became known as the Great Migration. They cleared forests, built stone walls, and established towns along the rocky coastline, shaping the landscape of North America. While colonies took root on the mainland, the English turned their attention to the sun-drenched islands of the Caribbean. In 1625, settlers arrived on Barbados, followed by Jamaica. They soon discovered the soil was perfect for sugarcane. Sugar production was labor-intensive and highly profitable, transforming the islands into the economic engines of the early empire. But beneath this lush beauty lay a deep and tragic human cost. Millions of enslaved African people were forced across the ocean. This dark chapter reshaped the demographics and culture of the Caribbean forever, leaving a legacy that still echoes through the islands. Throughout the 17th century, England and the Netherlands fought naval wars over trade routes and shipping lanes. In 1664, an English fleet sailed into the harbor of New Amsterdam, a Dutch colony on Manhattan Island. The English took control and renamed it New York. The harbor became a vital hub for the growing British network. In 1707, the Acts of Union joined England and Scotland into a single sovereign state called Great Britain. This union created a unified force equipped to project power globally. The first Union Jack flag began to fly from the masts of ships. As the ship sails into the distance, let the history rest. Sleep now, traveler, carried by the gentle waves of time. With the British state unified, the 18th century became an era of intense global rivalry, primarily with France. The two powers clashed in a series of conflicts that spanned the globe, culminating in the 7 Years' War, which lasted from 1756 to 1763. This conflict was, in many ways, the first true world war fought on battlefields in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, and India. In North America, British forces, led by General James Wolfe, clashed with the French on the Plains of Abraham outside Quebec in 1759. The British victory there, though costly, led to the fall of French Canada. With the Treaty of Paris in 1763, France ceded almost all of its North American territories to Britain. The vast, quiet pine forests of Canada, the deep fishing waters of the St. Lawrence River, and the fur trading outposts of the interior all came under the British Crown, dramatically expanding the geographic reach of the empire. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the East India Company was quietly transforming from a trading enterprise into a ruling power. In 1757, a young military officer named Robert Clive led a force of company soldiers and local sepoys. Indian soldiers trained in European tactics at the Battle of Plassey in Bengal. Facing the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies, Clive secured a decisive victory through a mixture of military strategy and backroom diplomacy. This victory allowed the company to install a puppet ruler and, a few years later, secure the Diwani, the right to collect land revenues in the incredibly wealthy province of Bengal. Suddenly, a private corporation of merchants based in London held administrative and tax-collecting power over millions of people. The quiet wealth of Bengal's rice fields, silk weavers, and spice markets began to flow directly into the company's treasuries, altering the course of Indian history. This rapid expansion of territory, however, brought immense financial pressure. To pay off the staggering debts incurred during the 7 Years' War, the British Parliament looked to its 13 North American colonies, arguing that the colonists should help pay for the military forces that protected them. Parliament passed a series of taxes, including the Stamp Act of 1765 and the Tea Act of 1773. These measures sparked deep resentment among the colonists, who argued They should not be taxed without representation in the British Parliament. Tensions escalated in quiet seaside towns like Boston, leading to protests and, eventually, the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War in 1775. With the help of France and Spain, the colonies secured their independence, and in 1783, Britain formally recognized the United States of America. The loss of these 13 wealthy colonies was a massive blow, marking the end of what historians call the First British Empire. Yet, even as one door closed, another was quietly opening in the southern seas. In 1768, the Royal Navy commissioned a skilled navigator named James Cook to command an expedition to the Pacific Ocean, sailing on a sturdy former coal collier renamed the HMS Endeavour. Cook's official mission was to observe the transit of Venus across the sun, but he also carried secret orders to search for a rumored southern continent. In 1770, Cook charted the eastern coast of Australia, naming it New South Wales and claiming it for the British Crown. He also charted the 2 main islands of New Zealand. Cook's voyages were marvels of scientific navigation, mapping vast, quiet reaches of the Pacific that had long been unknown to Europe. The gentle lap of the Pacific waves against the hull of the Endeavour marked the beginning of a new chapter of British interest in the southern hemisphere. With the loss of the American colonies, Britain faced a practical problem: where to send its convicted criminals, who had previously been transported to the tobacco plantations of Maryland and Virginia. The quiet, distant shores of Australia seemed like the perfect solution. On May 13, 1787, a fleet of 11 ships, known as the First Fleet, set sail from Portsmouth under the command of Governor Arthur Phillip, carrying over 700 convicts alongside soldiers and crew. The fleet made an extraordinary 8-month journey across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. In January 1788, they established the first penal colony at Port Jackson, which would grow into the city of Sydney. Life in this isolated outpost was incredibly harsh and quiet, surrounded by unfamiliar eucalyptus forests and strange wildlife. Far removed from the bustling streets of London, as the 19th century dawned, Britain found itself locked in another titanic struggle, this time against revolutionary and Napoleonic France. For over 2 decades, the two nations fought across Europe and the oceans. Britain's primary defense was its navy, and in October 1805, Admiral Horatio Nelson secured one of the most famous naval victories in history at the Battle of Trafalgar off the coast of Spain. Though Nelson was mortally wounded, his fleet shattered the combined French and Spanish navies, ensuring that Britain would hold undisputed command of the world's oceans for more than a century. This naval supremacy became the absolute foundation of the 19th century empire, allowing British merchant ships to sail quietly and securely to any port on the planet, protected by the distant but absolute power of the Royal Navy. With the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, Great Britain entered a period of relatively peaceful dominance, often called the Pax Britannica. For nearly a century, no other European power could seriously challenge British supremacy at sea. During this quiet era of peace, the Industrial Revolution transformed the British home islands, turning quiet market towns into bustling manufacturing centers. To fuel these factories, Britain imported raw materials from every corner of the globe: cotton from India, wool from Australia, and palm oil from West Africa, and exported manufactured goods in return. This global trade network was held together by a vast fleet of merchant steamships, which slowly began to replace traditional wooden sailing vessels. These coal-powered ships left dark plumes of smoke trailing across quiet, open ocean horizons as they maintained the steady heartbeat of imperial commerce among the many commodities traded across the empire. Tea held a particularly special place in the hearts of the British public. Initially, all tea had to be imported from China, which kept prices high and created a massive trade deficit as the Chinese only accepted silver in exchange. To break this monopoly, the East India Company smuggled tea plants out of China and began cultivating them on the misty, green hillsides of Assam in northeastern India. By the mid-19th century, vast, quiet tea plantations stretched across the Indian hills, producing a robust, dark tea that became an affordable staple in every British household. The simple act of drinking a warm cup of tea in a quiet parlor in London was connected to a global network of shipping, agricultural labor, and botanical trade to protect these valuable trade routes to India and the Far East. The British kept a watchful eye on strategic geographical passages. One of the most important was the southern tip of Africa, which ships had to round when traveling between the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. In 1806, British forces seized the Cape Colony from the Dutch, establishing a permanent base at Cape Town beneath the quiet shadow of Table Mountain. The arrival of British settlers led to rising tensions with the existing Dutch descent farmers, known as Boers, who valued their independence. In the 1830s, thousands of Boers packed their belongings into wooden ox carts and traveled north into the peak interior in a migration known as the Great Trek. This movement set the stage for future conflicts. As the British slowly expanded their influence over the rich mineral lands of the interior in the early decades of the 19th century, the British Empire also made a historic decision to end the transatlantic slave trade. Following decades of tireless campaigning by abolitionists and the enslaved people themselves, the British Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which made the trading of enslaved people illegal across the empire. The Royal Navy established the West Africa Squadron, a fleet of ships tasked with patrolling the warm, quiet waters of the West African coast to intercept illegal slave ships and release those held on board. In 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act formally outlawed slavery itself throughout most of the British colonies, replacing it with a temporary system of apprenticeship and compensating slave owners with massive financial sums. While the newly freed individuals received nothing to replace the labor force on the Caribbean sugar plantations, British administrators introduced a system of indentured labor. Between 1838 and 1917, over 500,000 people from India were recruited and transported across the oceans to work in the Caribbean, particularly in Trinidad and Guyana, as well as in other colonies like Fiji and Mauritius. These workers signed contracts promising a return passage after several years of labor, but many chose to stay, permanently weaving Indian traditions, language, and culture into the vibrant tropical fabric of these distant colonies. The quiet, long voyages across the Indian and Atlantic Oceans carried these families, their hopes and fears whispered to the passing waves farther north. The vast wilderness of Canada was quiet and sparsely populated, but it was slowly growing. In 1867, the British North America Act brought together several provinces into a unified, self-governing federation called the Dominion of Canada. This new status allowed Canada to govern its own internal affairs while remaining a loyal part of the British Empire. To connect the Atlantic coast with the quiet shores of the Pacific, construction began on the Canadian Pacific Railway. Thousands of laborers laid steel tracks across the endless flat prairies, over the towering, snow-capped Rocky Mountains, and through deep, silent pine forests. The completion of the railway in 1885 allowed people and goods to travel from coast to coast in just a few days, binding the massive, quiet nation together under a single government. In the mid-19th century, a quiet botanical garden on the banks of the River Thames became the scientific heart of the global empire. The Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, near London, was transformed into a central clearinghouse for plants of economic value. Botanists at Kew studied how to transport fragile seedlings across thousands of miles of oceans, using specialized glass cases called Wardian cases. They successfully transported rubber seeds collected from the Brazilian rainforest to Kew, grew them into healthy saplings, and then shipped them to the warm, tropical colonies of Malaya and Ceylon. This quiet transfer of plants created massive new rubber plantations, transforming the local landscapes and fueling the global demand for rubber as the bicycle and automotive industries began to grow. As the 19th century reached its final decades, the attention of the European powers turned toward the vast and largely unmapped interior of Africa. In what became known as the Scramble for Africa, European nations competed to claim territories. Culminating in the Berlin Conference of 1884, Britain secured vast swaths of land, stretching from Egypt in the north to South Africa in the south. Driven by the ambitious dream of an uninterrupted Cape to Cairo railway, the dry deserts of Sudan, the lush grasslands of East Africa, and the rolling hills of Zimbabwe were all marked on imperial maps, their quiet, ancient rhythms meeting the sudden arrival of surveyors, telegraph wires, and boundary stones. Our journey now drifts into the later decades of the 19th century, an era when the physical distances of the globe began to shrink under the influence of new technologies. One of the most transformative changes to the trade routes of the empire occurred in Egypt, where a French company had spent 10 years carving a path through the sand to connect the Mediterranean Sea directly to the Red Sea. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 changed everything. Suddenly, ships traveling from London to Bombay no longer had to brave the long, stormy journey around the southern tip of Africa. The journey was cut by thousands of miles and several weeks. In 1875, the British Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, seized a quiet opportunity to purchase a massive share in the canal company from the cash-strapped ruler of Egypt. This acquisition secured British control over what became known as the Highway to India. The quiet, blue waters of the canal, flanked by vast deserts of silent, shifting sand, became the vital artery of the global empire, where steamships passed day and night, steady procession, as the physical ties between Britain and India grew stronger. The political relationship also took on a grander, more formal character. Following the uprising of 1857, the British government had dissolved the East India Company and assumed direct control of India. A period known as the British Raj. In 1876, Parliament passed the Royal Titles Act, and on the first day of 1800s-style pageantry in 1877, Queen Victoria was formally proclaimed Empress of India. In Delhi, a grand, quiet assembly known as the Imperial Durbar was held to mark the occasion, while Victoria herself never set foot in India. Her portrait hung in every government office, and her image was stamped on millions of silver rupees. This symbolic act was meant to unite the diverse princely states and provinces of India under a single, distant sovereign. The quiet majesty of the crown became a unifying concept, whispered in offices, courts, and palaces across the subcontinent to bind this sprawling global network together. The British began laying a vast, silent network of telegraph cables along the dark, cold floor of the world's oceans. Completed in the early 20th century, this network was known as the All-Red Line because it touched only British territories, which were traditionally colored red or pink on world maps. Thick, heavy copper wires, insulated with the quiet sap of tropical gutta-percha trees, were unspooled from the backs of massive cable-laying ships. These lines rested in the absolute silence of the deep ocean, far below the reach of storms and waves. For the first time in human history, messages that once took months to travel by sail could be sent in a matter of minutes. A government office in London could communicate quietly and instantly with administrators in Singapore, Sydney, or Ottawa. The world became interconnected by a silent pulse of electricity, humming softly beneath the oceans. While telegraphs carried messages, a massive surge of migration was carrying people to the southern edges of the African continent. In 1867, a brilliant, sparkling stone was found on the banks of the Orange River, sparking a massive diamond rush in a quiet area that would become the town of Kimberley. Nearly 20 years later, in 1886, prospectors discovered an incredibly rich ridge of gold-bearing reef in the Transvaal region, known as the Witwatersrand. These discoveries transformed the quiet, agricultural landscape of South Africa into a bustling, industrial frontier. Thousands of miners, engineers, and financial speculators arrived from all over the world, seeking their fortunes in the dust. This sudden influx of wealth and people created immense political tension between the British authorities and the independent Boer republics, slowly eroding the peace of the region and setting the stage for a conflict that would test the limits of the empire's military power to manage this complex global system of trade, shipping, and communication. The world required a standardized way to keep track of time. In 1884, representatives from 25 nations gathered in Washington, D.C., for the International Meridian Conference. They voted to adopt the longitude passing through the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, London, as the prime meridian, representing 0 degrees longitude. This decision established Greenwich Mean Time, or GMT, as the international standard for timekeeping. Across the oceans, sea captains adjusted their marine chronometers to the time in Greenwich, allowing them to calculate their precise position on the open water. In railway stations, post offices, and ports across the empire, clocks began to tick in unison. The quiet, steady movement of brass gears and pendulums synchronized the daily lives of millions of people, aligning the global empire to a single quiet heartbeat in the midst of this global expansion. The architectural landscape of the empire was also undergoing a quiet transformation. In India, British architects began blending traditional European classical styles with elements of Islamic, Hindu, and Byzantine design, a style known as Indo-Saracenic architecture. In Bombay, construction began on the Victoria Terminus, a massive, ornate railway station complete with towering stone arches, intricate carvings of local flora and fauna, and a grand dome topped by a statue of progress. This building, which took a decade to complete, was a monument to the power of steam and steel. Yet its stone walls also paid quiet tribute to the ancient artistic traditions of India. In cities like Calcutta, Madras, and Singapore, grand colonial buildings rose alongside busy harbors, their white columns and shaded verandas standing in quiet contrast to the warm, vibrant life of the streets around them. As we let these historical details settle in our minds, we can feel the vastness of this interconnected world, held together by shipping lanes, telegraph cables, and the quiet passage of time. The night is still, the world is quiet, and the gentle rhythm of the past continues to carry you toward a deep, peaceful sleep. While grand stone monuments rose in distant colonial capitals, the very physical nature of British shipping was undergoing a quiet revolution on the open seas. For centuries, the speed of trade had been dictated entirely by the unpredictable whims of the wind. But the mid-19th century saw the rise of the ultimate wooden sailing ships, the clipper ships, designed with long, narrow hulls and towering masts, carrying immense spreads of canvas. These ships were built for sheer speed. The most famous of these was the Cutty Sark. Launched in 1869, these vessels competed in the legendary annual tea races, rushing the first harvest of the season from the docks of Shanghai down through the warm, quiet waters of the South China Sea, across the vast Indian Ocean, and around the Cape of Good Hope to the tea markets of London. The winning ship earned immense prestige and premium prices for its cargo. The sight of these magnificent, silent giants slicing through the dark ocean waves under a canopy of stars remains one of the most romantic images of an era when the oceans were the only highways connecting the continents at the same time. A quieter, less visible form of exchange was reshaping the natural world. British settlers migrating to the temperate zones of the empire, especially Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, sought to recreate the familiar landscapes of their home country. They established acclimatization societies dedicated to introducing European plants and animals to these new lands. In 1859, a wealthy settler named Thomas Austin released 24 wild European rabbits on his estate in Victoria, Australia, simply wanting to enjoy the familiar pastime of rabbit hunting. With no natural predators and a perfect climate, the rabbit population exploded with astonishing speed, spreading across thousands of miles of the Australian interior within a few decades. This quiet introduction of a seemingly harmless animal forever altered the fragile ecosystems of the continent, stripping the grassy plains and competing with native wildlife for food. It serves as a powerful reminder of how even the smallest, most quiet actions of imperial settlers could trigger massive, irreversible consequences across the globe in the far north of the American continent. The pursuit of another natural resource led to the quiet exploration of the vast Canadian wilderness. For nearly 2 centuries, the Hudson's Bay Company, established by royal charter in 1670, held exclusive trading rights over a massive territory known as Rupert's Land, an area comprising more than a third of modern-day Canada. Rather than building towns or cities, the company established a quiet network of fortified trading posts at the mouths of major rivers, such as York Factory on the shores of the cold, misty Hudson Bay. Indigenous trappers exchanged valuable beaver pelts for blankets, metal kettles, and iron tools. The beaver fur was shipped back to London to be manufactured into the highly fashionable top hats worn by the European elite. The life of a fur trader was incredibly isolated and silent, spent navigating deep rivers in birchbark canoes and enduring long, dark subarctic winters where the only sound was the crackle of the northern lights across the frozen sky. This vast trading empire began to shift toward formal government administration as the 20th century approached. In 1899, the British government faced its most significant colonial conflict in decades, the Second Boer War in South Africa. The war was fought between the British Empire and the 2 independent Boer republics, the South African Republic and the Orange Free State. What the British military expected to be a short, straightforward campaign turned into a long, grueling conflict that lasted nearly 3 years. The Boer farmers, highly skilled marksmen who knew the rugged, dry landscape intimately, used highly effective guerrilla tactics to harass the slow-moving British columns. To counter this, the British military, led by Lord Kitchener, resorted to a controversial scorched earth policy, burning Boer farms, destroying crops, and confining civilian families to concentration camps. The heavy toll of the war sparked intense debate back in Britain, shaking the nation's self-confidence and casting a long, sobering shadow over the final years of the Victorian era. Despite these political storms, the cultural influence of the empire continued to spread quietly and permanently through a seemingly simple medium: organized sports. During the 19th century, British administrators, soldiers, and educators carried their favorite games to every colony, establishing clubs and rules that are still used today. Cricket, initially a rural English pastime, became deeply rooted in the social fabric of India, the Caribbean, Australia, and South Africa. In the West Indies, the game was embraced by local populations and became a powerful means of self-expression and cultural identity. Similarly, rugby took firm root in the rugged soils of New Zealand and South Africa, while association football soccers spread along the trade routes and railway lines to become the world's most popular sport. These games, played on quiet green fields under tropical suns or southern skies, created a shared global language that survived long after the formal structures of the empire faded away as the old century gave way to the new. The passing of an era was marked by a quiet, collective moment of grief. On January 22, 1901, Queen Victoria died at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight at the age of 81, ending a reign of nearly 64 years. For the vast majority of people living within the British Empire, she was the only monarch they had ever known. Her reign had spanned the rise of the railway, the telegraph, the steamship, and the peak of British global dominance. Her funeral procession through the quiet, winter-chilled streets of London was watched by silent crowds, marking not just the passing of a queen, but the end of the long Victorian age. The crown passed to her eldest son, Edward VII. And as the new Edwardian era began, the empire stood at the absolute zenith of its territorial size. Yet the quiet currents of change were already beginning to ripple beneath the surface of the global landscape. Let these quiet images of sailing ships, northern forests, and peaceful playing fields drift through your mind as you relax. The night is deep, the room is still, and the gentle flow of history continues to carry you softly toward sleep. Our journey now enters the quiet dawn of the 20th century, a period when the British Empire reached its greatest geographical extent, yet also began to experience a subtle shifting of its internal foundations. In the early years of the new century, the British government began to formalize a new political relationship with its highly developed English-speaking colonies. Rather than governing these territories directly from the offices of Whitehall in London, Britain recognized them as dominions. This status granted them complete control over their own domestic affairs, while they remained loyal under the shared umbrella of the British Crown. Canada had achieved this status in 1867, and on the first day of 1901, the 6 separate colonies of Australia officially united to form the Commonwealth of Australia. This was followed by New Zealand in 1907 and the Union of South Africa in 1910. These new nations were vast and quiet, populated by communities that still looked to London as the cultural center of their world, yet were slowly and steadily growing their own distinct identities under their own southern and northern stars. This transition toward self-governing dominions was accompanied by a massive, quiet wave of migration from the British Isles. Millions of families packed their belongings into wooden crates and boarded large steamships, seeking new beginnings in the wide open spaces of the Southern Hemisphere. Many of these settlers were drawn to the fertile, rolling plains of New Zealand, a country that became known to some as the Britain of the South. Here, the temperate climate and rich soil were ideal for dairy farming and sheep rearing. The quiet, green valleys of both the North and South Islands were soon dotted with millions of sheep, and the introduction of refrigerated shipping in the late 19th century allowed New Zealand butter, cheese, and mutton to be transported halfway across the globe to the dinner tables of London. The long, silent voyage of these refrigerated cargo ships across the vast, deep waters of the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans kept the distant islands closely bound to the economic life of the mother country. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, a very different kind of territory was being integrated into the global network of the empire. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, British administrators in Southeast Asia focused their attention on the Malay Peninsula, a region of dense, quiet rainforests and rich mineral deposits. Recognizing the global demand for tin to supply the canning industries of Europe and North America, the British established protectorates over the various Malay states, collectively known as British Malaya. To extract the tin, they built roads, railways, and bustling ports like Singapore and Penang. They also encouraged the migration of hundreds of thousands of laborers from China and southern India to work in the tin mines and on the rapidly expanding rubber plantations. This quiet movement of people transformed the cultural and demographic landscape of the peninsula, creating a vibrant, diverse society that lived and worked beneath the hot tropical sun, surrounded by the silent, ancient growth of the jungle. At the heart of this vast, interconnected system lay the world's most powerful financial center, the City of London. In the early 20th century, the British pound sterling was the undisputed global currency, backed by the absolute stability of the gold standard. Every major international trade transaction, whether it involved Brazilian coffee, American cotton, or Chinese silk, was settled through the quiet wood-paneled banking houses of London. The steady, rhythmic scratch of fountain pens on heavy ledger books and the quiet ticking of grandfather clocks in banking parlors represented the invisible power that held the global economy together. British investors poured billions of pounds into building railways in South America, ports in China, and mines in Africa, making Great Britain the world's creditor nation. This financial network operated quietly and continuously, bridging oceans and continents with a silent stream of capital. As we reflect on these quiet networks of trade, migration, and finance, we can feel the deep stability that once seemed to define this global system. The air is still, the night is peaceful, and the gentle flow of history continues to carry you softly toward a deep, restful sleep, while the financial gears of the City of London turned with quiet precision. The vast, icy northern reaches of the empire were witnessing a different kind of quiet endurance. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Canadian government sought to assert its authority over the immense, silent territories of the Yukon and the Northwest Territories. The catalyst was the discovery of gold in 1896 along the Klondike River, a remote tributary of the Yukon. This sparked one of the most famous gold rushes in history, drawing over 100,000 prospectors into a landscape of extreme cold and breathtaking silence. To maintain order, the Canadian government dispatched the Northwest Mounted Police later, known as the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. These officers, dressed in their iconic scarlet tunics, established posts along the mountain passes and frozen rivers, enforcing strict safety rules that prevented starvation and chaos. The image of a lone Mountie patrolling the snow-covered pine forests on a dog sled, surrounded by the absolute silence of the subarctic winter, became a powerful symbol of British law and order, extending to the very edges of the known world across the Atlantic. A quieter but equally profound transformation was taking place in the agricultural heartlands of the United Kingdom. For centuries, British farming had been the quiet backbone of the nation, but the influx of cheap grain from the vast prairies of Canada and the United States, along with refrigerated meat from Australia and New Zealand, created a prolonged agricultural depression in the late Victorian and Edwardian eras. Many wealthy landowners found themselves with shrinking incomes, leading to a quiet decline in the grand lifestyle of the British country house. Beautiful estates, surrounded by ancient oak trees and quiet green meadows, began to transition from centers of agricultural power to serene, private retreats. Many aristocratic families looked to marry wealthy American heiresses, often called dollar princesses, to bring much-needed capital back to their historic estates. This quiet merging of Old World prestige and New World wealth helped preserve the architectural heritage of the British countryside, ensuring that these grand stone houses remained standing in silent dignity amidst their rolling parks further south, along the ancient trade routes of the Mediterranean. The British kept a quiet but firm grip on strategic islands that served as stepping stones to India, the small, rocky archipelago of Malta, which had voluntarily asked to become part of the British Empire in 1814, served as the primary base for the Royal Navy's Mediterranean fleet. The grand, deep waters of Valletta's Grand Harbor were constantly filled with the imposing gray hulls of British battleships, their massive steam engines resting quietly alongside ancient sandstone fortifications built by the Knights of St. John. The Maltese people, with their unique language blending Arabic and Italian roots, lived in quiet harmony with the British garrison. The island became a bustling cosmopolitan hub where sailors, merchants, and colonial administrators crossed paths. The gentle lap of the blue Mediterranean waves against the sun-warmed stone walls of Valletta represented a vital link in the chain of naval bases that secured the empire's global reach. As we let these images of frozen northern trails, quiet country estates, and sun-warmed Mediterranean harbors drift through our minds, we can feel the vast, diverse tapestry of this global network. The night is still, the room is quiet, and the gentle rhythm of history continues to carry you softly toward a deep, restful sleep, while the Mediterranean remained a vital corridor of naval movement. Another crucial geographic checkpoint lay thousands of miles to the east, where the Indian Ocean meets the Pacific. At the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula sat the island of Singapore, which had been founded as a British trading post by Sir Stamford Raffles in 1819. By the early 20th century, this once quiet fishing village had grown into one of the busiest and most strategic ports in the entire world. Singapore was the administrative heart of the Straits settlements, a collection of British territories that also included Malacca and Penang. The port operated as a free trade zone, meaning that goods from all over the world could be landed, stored, and reshipped without paying custom duties. The harbor was a spectacular, quiet forest of masts and steam funnels, where Chinese junks, Malay outriggers, and massive British cargo steamers rested side by side on the calm tropical waters. The moist, heavy air of the city carried the rich, mingling scents of nutmeg, pepper, raw rubber, and coal smoke, creating a sensory bridge between the deep jungles of the interior and the global shipping lanes of the open ocean. In the streets of Singapore, a unique culture was quietly flourishing among the descendants of Chinese immigrants who had married local Malay women, known as the Peranakans or Straits Chinese. This community developed a rich, distinctive lifestyle that blended Chinese traditions with Malay language, cuisine, and British civic colonial life. Their homes, built as narrow, deep shophouses with beautifully tiled courtyards, stood in quiet, shaded rows along the city's busy streets. The Peranakans often received British education and became prominent merchants, lawyers, and community leaders who played a vital role in the smooth running of the colony. In the quiet evenings, families would gather on their cool, tiled verandas, the women dressed in exquisite, hand-embroidered kebaya blouses, sharing dishes that combined spicy Malay flavors with traditional Chinese ingredients. This quiet, prosperous community represented a perfect synthesis of the diverse cultural currents that flowed through the maritime crossroads of the British Empire. Meanwhile, in the warm, quiet waters of the southern Pacific, British influence was expanding through a very different kind of maritime activity, the harvesting of the oceans. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the global demand for whale oil, used for lighting lamps and lubricating the machinery of the Industrial Revolution, drew British whaling vessels deep into the subantarctic waters surrounding New Zealand and the Southern Islands. These voyages were incredibly long, arduous, and quiet, often lasting several years at a time. Ships would depart from British ports like Hull or London and disappear into the vast trackless wilderness of the southern oceans for months on end, completely cut off from the rest of humanity. When a whale was sighted, the crew would launch small wooden rowboats into the icy swells, pursuing the massive creatures in absolute silence until the moment of the strike. The success of a voyage depended entirely on the skill, courage, and quiet endurance, who lived in constant close proximity to the immense, untamed forces of nature. Once a whale was captured, the crew would anchor in a quiet, sheltered bay along the coast of New Zealand or Tasmania to process the blubber in temporary shore stations. These lonely outposts, nestled beneath towering cliffs of dark stone and dense, green fern forests, were the first points of contact between British sailors and the local Mbori and Aboriginal populations. Over time, these brief encounters grew into more permanent relationships, with many indigenous men joining the crews of whaling and sealing ships, proving themselves to be exceptionally skilled navigators and mariners on the rough southern seas. The quiet, isolated beaches where these early interactions took place were the quiet nurseries of a new, blended Pacific society, where distinct languages, technologies, and traditions began to slowly intertwine. When the whaling season ended, the ships would begin their long, silent journey back to the northern hemisphere, their holds filled with barrels of precious oil, to light the streets and factories of a distant industrial world far to the west. In the dry, sun-drenched interior of the Australian continent, another group of pioneers was facing a different kind of quiet isolation. The late 19th century saw the rapid expansion of the Australian pastoral industry, with massive sheep and cattle stations established across the vast semi-arid plains of the outback. These properties were immense, often covering hundreds of thousands of acres of dry grass and red earth, where the horizon stretched out in an unbroken, silent circle in every direction. To manage these gargantuan herds of livestock, station owners relied heavily on the skill and deep environmental knowledge of Aboriginal stockmen. These quiet, highly capable men and women possessed an intimate understanding of the landscape, knowing exactly where to find hidden waterholes and how to navigate the trackless bush without the aid of maps or compasses. The daily life on these remote stations was marked by a slow, rhythmic routine of long days spent in the saddle under a hot, cloudless sky, followed by quiet evenings spent sleeping under a brilliant canopy of southern stars, where the only sound was the distant, haunting howl of a dingo. To transport the wool and beef from these isolated inland stations to the busy coastal ports of Adelaide, Melbourne, and Sydney, the colonists constructed massive networks of railways and overland stock routes. The most famous of these was the Overland Telegraph Line, completed in 1872, which stretched for nearly 2,000 miles directly through the red, empty heart of the continent, from Adelaide to Darwin. The construction of this line was a monumental feat of human endurance, requiring the transport of thousands of wooden and iron telegraph poles across trackless deserts and through rocky mountain ranges. Once completed, this single wire of copper connected Australia directly to the submarine cables of the East, bringing the quiet, isolated communities of the outback into instant, silent communication with the rest of the global empire. The lonely telegraph stations, staffed by small groups of operators who lived in absolute isolation in the middle of the desert, became vital outposts of progress, their keys tapping out a steady, rhythmic code that traveled across the silence of the continent. As we let these quiet images of tropical harbors, southern oceans, and wide-open desert plains drift through our minds, we can feel the vastness and the deep, silent connection that bound these distant worlds together. The night is still, the room is quiet, and the gentle, steady flow of history continues to carry you softly toward a deep, peaceful sleep. Our journey moves north from the dry plains of the Australian outback to the quiet, misty mountain ranges of the Himalayas, where the British Empire established some of its most unique administrative outposts. In the 19th century, as the intense heat of the summer months settled over the vast plains of northern India, the British government sought a cooler, more temperate environment from which to govern. This search led to the development of the hill stations, settlements perched high in the green mountains, surrounded by cool breezes and quiet forests of pine, oak, and rhododendron. The most famous of these was Simla, located in the foothills of the Himalayas. Every spring, a massive, quiet migration occurred as the entire central government of India, along with tons of paperwork, files, and personal belongings, packed up in Calcutta and traveled over 1,000 miles to Simla for 6 months of the year. This quiet mountain town, nestled among the clouds, became the de facto summer capital of the British Raj. To make the journey to these high-altitude retreats easier, the British built remarkable narrow-gauge railways, known as the toy trains. Completed in 1903, the Calcutta-Simla Railway was an engineering marvel, winding its way up through over 100 quiet tunnels and across hundreds of elegant stone bridges. The steam locomotives chugged slowly and quietly up the steep slopes, their steady, rhythmic puffing echoing through the deep, pine-scented valleys. From the open windows of the wooden carriages, passengers could gaze out at the spectacular, panoramic views of the snow-capped mountain peaks rising in silent grandeur against the pale blue sky. In Simla itself, life took on a quiet, slow-paced routine that closely mirrored that of an English country village. British officers and their families strolled along the ridge, a wide open promenade with stunning mountain views, or gathered for quiet tea parties in half-timbered, Tudor-style villas that sat nestled among the misty green hillsides, while Simla served as the political heart of the summer government. The hills of northeastern India became home to a different kind of quiet landscape. In the region of Darjeeling, located in the shadow of the mighty Kanchenjunga mountain range, the British discovered that the cool climate, rich volcanic soil, and abundant rainfall were perfect for growing tea. They began carving out vast, quiet plantations on the steep mountain slopes, replacing the dense jungle with neat terraced rows of bright green tea bushes. Thousands of local workers, primarily from Nepal and Sikkim, were hired to carefully pick the delicate young tea leaves, their hands moving with quiet, practiced precision among the bushes. The harvested leaves were processed in local factories, withered, rolled, and dried over quiet wood fires before being packed into elegant wooden chests and transported down the mountains. This Darjeeling tea, known for its delicate, floral aroma and golden color, became one of the most sought-after varieties in the world, bringing a quiet touch of Himalayan mist to teapots across the globe. To the south of these mountain retreats lay the vast, quiet delta of the Ganges, where the British built their primary commercial capital, Calcutta. Founded as a trading post in the late 17th century, Calcutta grew to become the city of palaces, characterized by grand neoclassical public buildings, wide avenues, and expansive green spaces like the Maidan. The city was a place of dramatic contrasts, where the quiet, orderly precincts of the British administrative quarter stood alongside the bustling, vibrant neighborhoods of the local Bengali population. Along the banks of the Hooghly River, a branch of the Ganges, stood massive warehouses filled with jute, indigo, tea, and grain, waiting to be loaded onto deep-draft merchant ships. The river itself was a quiet, constantly moving highway of trade, where traditional wooden country boats glided past modern steel steamships, their dark silhouettes reflecting in the muddy, slow-moving water under the warm, tropical sun. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Calcutta also became the epicenter of a quiet, intellectual, and cultural awakening known as the Bengal Renaissance. This movement saw a remarkable flowering of literature, art, philosophy, and science, led by brilliant local scholars and writers who blended traditional Indian learning with Western ideas. The most famous of these figures was Rabindranath Tagore, a poet and philosopher whose quiet, deeply spiritual writings would eventually earn him the Nobel Prize in Literature. In the quiet courtyards of traditional Bengali family homes, intellectuals gathered to engage in lively, thoughtful discussions about social reform, national identity, and the future of their country. This rich, intellectual environment quietly laid the foundations for a growing sense of national consciousness, setting the stage for the political movements that would shape the destiny of India in the decades to come, as we let these images of misty mountain railways, terraced tea gardens, and slow-moving delta rivers settle in our minds. We can feel the vast, quiet diversity of this historic world. The night is still, the room is quiet, and the gentle, steady flow of history continues to carry you softly toward a deep, peaceful sleep. Our journey now travels far to the west of the Himalayan peaks, crossing the vast Indian Ocean to the ancient, sun-drenched lands of East Africa. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the British government sought to secure its strategic interests in this region by constructing one of the most ambitious and challenging engineering projects of the colonial era, the Uganda Railway. The goal was to connect the quiet coastal port of Mombasa in modern-day Kenya with the fertile, quiet shores of Lake Victoria, deep in the African interior. This railway would allow British administrators to easily transport goods and troops, securing their influence over the headwaters of the Nile. Construction began in 1896, and thousands of skilled laborers were brought from India to lay the heavy iron tracks across an incredibly diverse, rugged, and quiet landscape of dry bush, steep volcanic valleys, and high, rolling grasslands. The building of the Uganda Railway was an epic of human endurance, taking place in a wilderness that had remained quiet and unchanged for thousands of years. The line had to climb from sea level up into the cool, misty highlands of Kenya, crossing deep gorges on massive, silent steel trestles before descending into the Great Rift Valley. The laborers lived in quiet, isolated tent camps along the path of the tracks, completely cut off from the outside world. Their daily routine was marked by the steady, rhythmic sound of pickaxes hitting rock and the quiet crackle of campfires under the vast, starry African sky. The progress of the railway was famously halted for several months in 1898 during the construction of a bridge over the Zavo River, where two large, quiet, man-eating lions began preying on the camp, creating an atmosphere of deep, silent dread before they were eventually hunted down. As the railway steadily pushed its way inland, it passed through a quiet, swampy area in the highlands that the local Maasai people called the place of cool waters, recognizing its strategic location halfway along the line. The railway administrators established a simple depot there in 1899. This humble collection of tin-roofed shacks and quiet wooden supply sheds grew with astonishing speed, eventually becoming the city of Nairobi. The cool, healthy climate of the highlands surrounding Nairobi attracted British settlers, who began establishing vast, quiet coffee and tea plantations on the fertile volcanic soils. The local wildlife, immense herds of wildebeest, zebras, and giraffes continued to roam the nearby plains, their quiet, ancient migrations occasionally crossing the path of the slow-moving steam locomotives, whose gentle, rhythmic puffing was the only modern sound in this vast, quiet wilderness. When the railway finally reached the quiet shores of Lake Victoria in 1901, it transformed the economy of East Africa. To connect the railway with the remote lakeside communities, the British transported entire steamships from the coast in thousands of small, labeled wooden crates. These pieces were carried up the mountains by train and then assembled by hand on the shores of the lake. These steamships, such as the SS Clement Hill, began to glide quietly across the vast, freshwater sea, carrying mail, passengers, and bags of locally grown cotton to the railway terminus for export to the textile mills of England. The quiet lap of the lake water against the steel hulls of these vessels represented the final link in a trade route that connected the isolated interior of Africa directly to the global markets of the world, bringing a quiet prosperity to the region to the north of this railway corridor. Along the dry, ancient banks of the Nile, another unique Anglo-Egyptian administration was maintaining a quiet hold over the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan after the decisive Battle of Omdurman in 1898. The British established a joint government with Egypt, known as a condominium, to administer this massive territory. The capital, Khartoum, located at the quiet confluence of the Blue and White Niles, was completely rebuilt by the British Governor-General, Lord Kitchener. He laid out the city streets in the shape of the Union Jack, creating wide, quiet avenues that allowed breeze to circulate and cool the buildings during the intense heat of the day. Along the banks of the river, elegant brick government buildings and shady gardens stood in quiet, dignified rows, while traditional wooden sailboats, known as feluccas, glided slowly past on the calm, brown waters of the Nile. To develop the economy of Sudan, the British launched a massive, quiet agricultural project in the fertile region between the Blue and White Niles, known as the Gezira Scheme. They constructed a network of quiet canals to channel the waters of the Nile onto the dry plains, transforming hundreds of thousands of acres of desert into productive fields of high-quality, long staple cotton. This project was managed with quiet, scientific precision, with British inspectors monitoring the water levels and agricultural practices to ensure a steady, high-yielding harvest. The cotton was picked by hand, packed into large sacks, and transported by rail to Port Sudan on the Red Sea, where it was loaded onto steamships bound for the industrial cities of Lancashire. This quiet transformation of the desert landscape created a stable source of income for the local population and secured another vital raw material for the global factories of the empire. As we let these quiet images of iron tracks winding through African highlands, steamships gliding across freshwater lakes, and slow-moving rivers watering the desert plains settle in our minds, we can feel the vastness and the deep, peaceful connections of this historical world. The night is still, the room is quiet, and the gentle, steady flow of history continues to carry you softly toward a deep, restful sleep. Section 11. Our journey now takes us to the vast, open plains of the Southern Hemisphere, where a quiet agricultural experiment forever changed the landscape and economy of Australia. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Australian farmers faced the immense challenge of growing wheat in a dry, unpredictable climate with low rainfall. A quiet, dedicated, English-born scientist named William Forer spent decades on his farm in New South Wales, carefully crossbreeding different varieties of wheat. In 1901, he successfully created a new strain called Federation wheat, named in honor of the newly formed Commonwealth of Australia. This remarkable plant was highly resistant to disease and could thrive in dry soils with minimal moisture. The widespread adoption of Federation wheat transformed the quiet, semi-arid plains of the Australian interior into a vast, golden sea of grain, turning Australia into one of the world's leading exporters of food. The sight of endless wheat fields swaying gently under a quiet southern sky became a symbol of agricultural prosperity. As this golden grain harvested from the interior reached the coast, it met another quiet revolution in transportation. To ship millions of tons of wheat, wool, and refrigerated meat across the hot tropical waters of the equator to the markets of Europe, British shipping lines developed highly advanced merchant steamships. Companies like the Port Line and the Aberdeen Line operated fleets of quiet, steel-hulled cargo ships equipped with sophisticated ventilation and refrigeration systems. These vessels traveled along carefully charted ocean routes, maintaining a steady speed that sailing ships could never guarantee. The long, silent voyages across the Indian Ocean and up through the Red Sea were managed by skilled crews who kept a constant watch on the ship's temperature-controlled cargo holds. The quiet arrival of these ships in the docks of London, Liverpool, and Cardiff brought a steady supply of fresh, affordable food to millions of families, quietly bridging the immense distance between southern pastures and northern tables. Meanwhile, in the warm, tropical waters of the Caribbean, a very different kind of agricultural landscape was adapting to the changing demands of the global market. Following the decline of the traditional sugar industry, British planters in Jamaica began cultivating bananas on a massive scale. The local climate, with its rich volcanic soil and frequent afternoon rain showers, was perfect for growing the sweet, delicate fruit. In the late 19th century, a quiet sea captain named Lorenzo Dow Baker realized that with fast steamships, he could transport green bananas from Jamaica to the ports of North America and Europe before they ripened and spoiled. This quiet realization sparked the creation of a massive, lucrative banana trade. The quiet, green valleys of Jamaica, nestled beneath the misty peaks of the Blue Mountains, were soon filled with neat plantations, where workers harvested the heavy green bunches by hand, transporting them to coastal ports on wooden rafts along quiet, winding rivers. This expansion of tropical agriculture was supported by the quiet work of researchers at the Imperial Department of Agriculture for the West Indies, established in 1898 with its headquarters in Barbados. This institution was staffed by quiet, dedicated botanists and scientists who studied plant diseases, soil chemistry, and pest control. They worked closely with local farmers, introducing hardier varieties of sugarcane, studying the cultivation of Sea Island cotton, and establishing experimental gardens to test new crops. This quiet application of scientific knowledge to tropical farming helped diversify the economies of the Caribbean islands, making them less dependent on a single crop. The peaceful, shaded laboratories and experimental plots of the department, surrounded by the vibrant colors of tropical hibiscus and bougainvillea, were quiet nurseries of agricultural innovation that helped stabilize the lives of thousands of families across the region. To the south of these Caribbean islands, on the wild, windswept edge of South America, lay one of the most remote and quiet outposts of the British Empire, the Falkland Islands. This rocky archipelago, surrounded by the cold, stormy waters of the South Atlantic, was home to a small, tight-knit community of British settlers who made their living primarily from sheep farming. The landscape was vast, open, and almost entirely treeless, characterized by rolling hills of yellow-green tussock grass, stone runs, and deep, quiet fjords where penguins nested along the shore. The life of a Falkland Island shepherd was incredibly quiet and isolated, spent tending large flocks of Corriedale and Romney sheep in the crisp, cold air. The valuable wool was carefully sheared by hand, pressed into heavy bales, and stored in wooden warehouses at the quiet port of Stanley, waiting for the annual arrival of the cargo ship that would carry it across the vast Atlantic to the woolen mills of Yorkshire. The strategic location of the Falkland Islands also made them a vital, quiet naval outpost for the Royal Navy. In December 1914, during the opening months of the First World War, the quiet waters of Port Stanley became the setting for a major naval engagement. A British squadron under Vice-Admiral Doveton Sturdy, which had arrived quietly to coal in the harbor, intercepted a powerful German squadron led by Admiral Maximilian von Spee. The resulting Battle of the Falkland Islands ended in a decisive British victory, securing British control over the vital shipping lanes of the South Atlantic and Cape Horn. After the thunder of the great naval guns faded, the islands returned to their deep, historic silence, with the cold southern wind sweeping over the grassy hills and the quiet waves lapping against the rusted ribs of old wooden sailing ships that had sought refuge in the sheltered harbors. As we let these quiet images of golden wheat fields, peaceful Caribbean valleys, and wind-swept southern islands settle in our minds, we can feel the vastness and the deep, silent connection of this historical world. The night is still, the room is quiet, and the gentle, steady flow of history continues to carry you softly toward a deep, peaceful sleep. Our journey continues as we follow the cold sea currents northward from the wind-swept islands of the South Atlantic to the rocky, wave-battered shores of Newfoundland, though today it is a province of Canada. For centuries, Newfoundland was England's oldest overseas colony, and later, a proud and independent dominion of the British Empire. The life of this quiet island was shaped entirely by the sea, specifically by the vast, shallow waters of the Grand Banks. For generations, thousands of families lived in tiny, isolated fishing villages called outports, nestled in the deep crevices of rugged stone cliffs. These communities were quiet and self-reliant, their wooden houses painted in bright, simple colors to pierce through the thick, gray Atlantic fogs that frequently rolled in from the ocean. The rhythm of daily life was dictated by the seasonal arrival of millions of cod, which were caught from small wooden dory boats, cleaned, salted, and dried on wooden platforms along the rocky shore. The dried cod of Newfoundland was an incredibly valuable commodity, packed into wooden casks and shipped across the globe to feed populations in southern Europe, West Africa, and the Caribbean. This trade created a quiet, constant coming and going of wooden sailing vessels in the harbor of St. John's, the colony's historic capital. The harbor was a sheltered, deep-water basin accessed through a narrow, dramatic gap in the cliffs known as the Narrows. From the heights of Signal Hill, which rose silently above the harbor entrance, observers could watch the steady arrival of ships from across the ocean. It was from this very hill, in December 1901, that the Italian inventor Guglielmo Marconi received the first wireless transatlantic signal, the letter S, in Morse code, sent from a station in Cornwall, England. This quiet breakthrough, utilizing the invisible currents of the air, marked the beginning of a new era of global communication happening on a cold, wind-swept cliff overlooking the silent northern seas. As the 20th century progressed, Newfoundland's quiet interior began to reveal riches of its own, drawing attention away from the traditional coastal fisheries. Deep within the island's dense forests of spruce and fir, geological surveyors discovered vast deposits of iron ore and copper. To exploit these resources, the government constructed the Newfoundland Railway, a narrow-gauge line that wound its way slowly through the rugged, silent heart of the island. Along the line, new towns emerged, centered around massive pulp and paper mills that turned the endless forests into paper for the newspapers of London and New York. The town of Grand Falls, built in a quiet river valley, became a bustling center of industry, yet it remained surrounded by a wilderness of absolute silence, where caribou herds continued their ancient, seasonal migrations across the peat bogs and quiet, pine-fringed lakes. while the northern forests of Newfoundland hummed with the quiet work of lumberjacks and miners. A very different kind of resource was being cultivated in the warm, tropical waters of the Pacific. In the late 19th century, the British government established a protectorate over the Solomon Islands, a scattered archipelago of lush, volcanic islands covered in dense rainforest. The primary economic interest in these islands was the production of copra, the dried meat of the coconut, which was highly valued in Europe for making soap and candles. British trading companies, such as Lever's Pacific Plantations, established extensive coconut estates along the quiet, sandy coasts of the islands. Millions of tall coconut palms were planted in neat geometric rows, their fronds rustling gently in the warm trade winds that swept across the quiet, turquoise lagoons. The process of producing copra was slow, rhythmic, and peaceful. Local workers gathered the fallen coconuts, split them open with heavy iron knives, and carefully scraped out the white meat. This meat was then dried in the sun on large wooden trays or over quiet, smoky fires in specialized drying houses, filling the tropical air with a sweet, oily fragrance. Once dried, the copra was packed into burlap sacks and loaded onto small coastal steamers that navigated the treacherous, reef-strewn waters of the archipelago. These ships gathered the harvest from remote plantation docks and brought it to the central port of Tulagi, where it was transferred to larger ocean-going vessels bound for the soap factories of northern England. This quiet maritime trade connected the isolated, tropical lives of the Pacific Islanders to the daily hygiene routines of millions of citizens in distant industrial cities. The expansion of the copra trade also brought a quiet transformation to the social structure of the Pacific Islands. To manage the vast plantations, the British established a system of administrative districts, overseen by lone district officers who lived in quiet, thatched-roof bungalows overlooking the sea. These officers traveled from village to village in wooden canoes or small motor launches, resolving disputes, census-taking, and administering basic medical care. Their presence introduced a slow, orderly system of British law that coexisted with the ancient, complex customs of the islanders. The quiet evenings in these remote outposts were filled with the gentle lap of the tide against the coral reefs, the distant, rhythmic beat of traditional wooden drums, and the soft, warm breeze carrying the scent of tropical flowers across the dark water far to the west of these tropical islands. On the ancient, dry plains of Mesopotamia, the British Empire was establishing a quiet presence that would shape the geopolitics of the modern world. In the years leading up to the First World War, the Royal Navy made a historic decision to transition its entire fleet from coal power to oil. This decision, championed by Winston Churchill, made the acquisition of secure oil supplies a matter of national survival. British geologists had already discovered vast reserves of oil in the hills of southwestern Persia, and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company began constructing a massive refinery at Abadan, on the quiet, muddy banks of the Shat al-Arab River. To protect this vital facility and secure the oil fields of neighboring Iraq, British forces established a quiet network of bases and treaties with local rulers along the Persian Gulf, ensuring that a steady stream of liquid energy flowed silently to the boilers of the British fleet. As we let these quiet images of fog-draped northern cliffs, rustling coconut palms, and slow-moving rivers in ancient lands settle in our minds, we can feel the vast, intricate web of connections that defined this global history. The night is still, the room is quiet, and the gentle, steady flow of history continues to carry you softly toward a deep, peaceful sleep. Our journey now takes us to the tranquil Emerald Hills of Ceylon, known today as Sri Lanka. Located just off the southern tip of India, this teardrop-shaped island became one of the most prosperous agrarian gems of the British Empire. In the early decades of the 19th century, British planters cleared the dense highland rainforests to plant vast estates of coffee. For a time, Ceylon was the leading coffee producer in the world, its mountain slopes carpeted in delicate white blossoms that filled the air with a sweet, jasmine-like scent. However, in the late 1860s, a quiet and devastating fungus, known as coffee rust, swept through the island, wiping out entire estates within a decade. Rather than abandoning the land, the resilient planters made a quiet, monumental shift. They cleared the ruined coffee bushes and planted tea, utilizing the rich mountain soil, misty altitudes, and abundant monsoon rains to harvest this new crop. Thousands of Tamil laborers traveled across the narrow Pak straight from southern India, establishing close-knit communities in the mountain districts. The process of plucking tea in Ceylon was a masterclass in quiet, rhythmic precision. Every morning, as the cool mountain mists began to rise, women wrapped in vibrant saris moved gracefully through the terraced green hillsides, picking only the top 2 leaves and a single bud from each branch. These leaves were tossed over their shoulders into large woven baskets slung across their backs. The harvested leaves were processed in local, multi-storied timber factories, where they were withered, rolled, oxidized, and dried. This Ceylon tea, prized for its bright, golden color and crisp flavor, was packed into wooden chests and shipped from the bustling harbor of Colombo to teapots around the globe, establishing a comforting ritual that brought the quiet mist of Ceylonese peaks into kitchens thousands of miles away. Ceylon was also home to another precious, quiet harvest, the collection of natural pearls from the Gulf of Mannar. For centuries, the shallow, warm waters between Ceylon and India had been famous for producing some of the finest, most lustrous pearls in the world. The British colonial government regulated this seasonal harvest with quiet, meticulous planning. During a pearl fishery, hundreds of traditional wooden boats from India, Arabia, and Ceylon gathered in the quiet, sheltered bays. The divers, working in pairs, descended to the seafloor, using heavy stone weights to sink quickly through the warm water. Holding their breath in the silent depths, they gathered oysters from the rocky reefs as quickly as possible before tugging on their safety lines to be hauled back to the surface. The oysters were piled on the shores in giant heaps to decompose, after which the organic residue was carefully washed away to reveal the shining, perfect pearls hidden within. Meanwhile, far to the south, the deep, cold waters surrounding the isolated subantarctic islands of the Indian Ocean were hosting a different kind of quiet marine exploitation. Islands such as the Kerguelen Archipelago and the Crozet Islands, though remote and inhospitable, were visited by British sealing vessels seeking the valuable skins and oil of fur seals and elephant seals. These voyages required immense physical endurance and a quiet acceptance of profound isolation. Ships spent months navigating stormy, gray seas where towering icebergs drifted silently past. Upon reaching the rocky, wind-swept shores of these volcanic islands, sailors lived in temporary wooden huts, enduring freezing rain and fierce gales. The oil obtained from the seals was stored in heavy oak casks and transported back to Britain, where it was used in industrial manufacturing, demonstrating how even the most desolate, silent corners of the globe were tied to the economic machinery of the empire. To navigate these treacherous, uncharted waters safely, the British Admiralty relied on the quiet, painstaking work of the Hydrographic Office. Established in 1795, this institution was tasked with creating highly accurate navigational charts of the world's oceans. Survey ships, such as the famous HMS Beagle, spent years tracing coastlines, measuring water depths with lead lines, and mapping hidden coral reefs and sandbars. This work was quiet and repetitive, requiring officers to spend long hours calculating mathematical formulas and hand-drawing detailed coastal profiles in their cabin journals. The resulting Admiralty charts were prized globally for their accuracy and reliability. They were distributed to merchant vessels and warships alike, providing a silent, trusted guide that allowed captains to navigate unfamiliar harbors and treacherous passages in the dark, laying the physical foundations for a safe, global maritime network. The expansion of this maritime trade was accompanied by the quiet rise of the marine salvage industry. As the volume of shipping grew, so too did the number of vessels that ran aground or foundered on remote reefs. Specialized salvage companies, often operating from strategic ports like Gibraltar, Aden, or Singapore, kept powerful steam tugs ready to race to the aid of distressed ships. These salvage operations were highly technical, requiring divers in heavy copper helmets and canvas suits to descend into the quiet, murky depths to patch damaged hulls, pump out flooded compartments, or recover valuable cargo from sunken wrecks. The quiet bravery and engineering skill of these salvage crews saved millions of pounds worth of property from being lost to the sea, ensuring that the vital, flowing lines of global commerce remained open and uninterrupted by the destructive forces of nature. As we let these quiet images of misty tea gardens, pearl divers in silent depths, and charts guiding ships through the dark drift through our minds, we can feel the vastness and the deep, peaceful connections of this historical world. The night is still, the room is quiet, and the gentle, steady flow of history continues to carry you softly toward a deep, restful sleep. Our path now leads us to the warm, shimmering waters of the Persian Gulf, a region where the British Empire maintained a quiet and highly unique presence for over a century. Unlike the direct administrative rule seen in India, British influence here was established through a series of maritime treaties with the local Arab rulers of the coast. In 1853, these rulers signed the Treaty of Maritime Peace in Perpetuity, which formally banned piracy and warfare in the Gulf waters, leading the region to be known to the British as the Trucial States, or Trucial Oman. To enforce this quiet peace, the Royal Navy stationed a small squadron of ships in these sun-baked waters. These vessels cruised slowly along the sandy, barren coastlines, their white hulls reflecting the brilliant glare of the desert sun. The quiet presence of these ships secured the vital shipping lanes that connected the oil fields of Persia and the markets of India to the rest of the world, maintaining a silent, steady watch over the shallow, turquoise waters, the primary local industry in this arid region. Long before the discovery of oil was the ancient and beautiful trade of pearling. The shallow, warm waters of the Persian Gulf, particularly around the island of Bahrain, were home to some of the richest oyster beds on Earth. During the summer pearling season, which ran from May to September, the coastal towns became quiet as virtually the entire male population boarded hundreds of traditional wooden sailing vessels known as dhows. These ships sailed out to the quiet, open waters of the Gulf, anchoring over the rocky oyster banks for months at a time. The dhows drifted in silent groups. The soft creak of their wooden rigging and the gentle lap of the warm water against their hulls, the only sounds breaking the vast silence of the sea under the blazing desert sky. The life of a GULF pearl diver was one of incredible physical discipline and quiet endurance. A diver would descend to the sea floor using a heavy stone attached to a rope, his only equipment being a simple nose clip made of curved horn and leather, and small leather thimbles to protect his fingers as he scraped oysters from the sharp rocks. He would remain in the silent, green depths for up to 2 minutes, gathering as many shells as he could carry in a small net bag around his neck, before pulling on his signal rope to be hauled back up by his partner on deck. This exhausting cycle was repeated 50 or 60 times a day. In the quiet evenings, the crews would rest on the crowded wooden decks of the dhows, opening the day's harvest under the watchful eye of the ship's captain, hoping to find a perfect, lustrous pearl that would bring financial security to their families back on the quiet shores. This quiet maritime economy was closely tied to the global trade networks managed by British administrators in India. The pearls harvested from the Gulf were brought to the bustling markets of Bombay, where they were sorted, polished, and sold to wealthy buyers from Europe and North America. In exchange, the dhows returned to the Trucial states, carrying essential supplies like rice, sugar, timber, and cotton cloth, which were not produced in the dry desert interior. The British political residents, stationed in quiet, whitewashed colonial villas in Bushehr and Bahrain, oversaw this trade and acted as mediators in local disputes, ensuring that the quiet, delicate balance of regional politics remained undisturbed. Their administrative work was slow and deliberate, conducted over long, formal meetings where cups of sweet, cardamom-spiced coffee were shared in the shaded courtyards of local palaces far to the south. In the vast, rolling grasslands of East Africa, another quiet administrative project was taking shape. In the early 20th century, the British government established the East Africa Protectorate, which would later become the colony of Kenya, to encourage economic development and help pay for the incredibly expensive Uganda Railway. The colonial administration invited British settlers to farm the fertile volcanic soils of the Rift Valley Highlands. This region, which sat at an altitude of several thousand feet above sea level, possessed a remarkably cool, temperate climate that was highly suited to European agriculture. The rolling green hills, surrounded by dense forests of cedar and olive trees, became known as the White Highlands, where settlers established spacious, quiet estates dedicated to growing coffee, tea, and pericium, natural insecticide made from dried chrysanthemum flowers. The daily routine on these highland farms was quiet and deeply connected to the natural rhythms of the African landscape. Settlers built comfortable stone houses with wide, shaded verandas and beautiful gardens filled with English roses and lavender, which bloomed alongside tropical bougainvillea. Every morning, as the cool mountain mists drifted through the valleys, local workers would gather to tend the crops, their voices carrying softly across the quiet fields. The harvested coffee beans and tea leaves were processed on the estates, packed into heavy burlap sacks, and transported to the nearest railway station. From there, the slow-moving steam trains of the Uganda Railway carried the cargo down to the coast, where it was loaded onto merchant ships bound for the busy ports of Europe. This quiet agricultural life, preserved in the memories and letters of the early pioneers, represented a peaceful, agrarian enclave nestled in the heart of a vast and wild continent further south. Along the rugged, windswept coastline of South Africa, the British maintained a network of quiet lighthouses to guide ships safely around the treacherous Cape of Good Hope. This stretch of ocean, where the warm Agulhas current meets the icy waters of the West Wind Drift, was famous for its violent storms and giant, unpredictable waves. To protect the vital shipping lanes, engineers constructed majestic stone lighthouses on remote, rocky cliffs such as Cape Point and Cape Agulhas. These towers stood as silent sentinels overlooking the vast, churning waters of the Southern Ocean. The life of a lighthouse keeper was incredibly isolated and quiet, spent maintaining the heavy brass mechanism of the rotating lens and ensuring that the paraffin lamp burned brightly through the darkest, most stormy nights. The steady, rhythmic sweep of the lighthouse beam across the dark, wild sea provided a comforting, silent guide to generations of sailors, navigating the edge of the continent as we let these quiet images of wooden dhows drifting over pearl beds, misty coffee farms in the African highlands, and lighthouse beams cutting through the dark ocean night settle in our minds. We can feel the vastness and the deep, silent connection of this historical world. The night is still, the room is quiet, and the gentle, steady flow of history continues to carry you softly toward a deep, peaceful sleep, leaving behind the windswept beacons of the African coast. Our journey travels deep into the quiet, warm heartlands of India to explore one of the most remarkable and peaceful scientific operations of the 19th century, the Great Trigonometrical Survey. Initiated in 1802 by the East India Company and continued under the British Raj. This monumental project aimed to measure the entire Indian subcontinent with absolute mathematical precision. Over several decades, small teams of quiet, dedicated surveyors, led by officers like William Lambton and George Everest, walked thousands of miles across every conceivable terrain. They traveled through dense, tropical jungles, navigated muddy river deltas, crossed dry, dusty plains, and climbed the cold, rocky peaks of the Himalayas, carrying massive, heavy brass instruments called theodolites, which weighed hundreds of pounds and required 12 men to carry. They established a vast, invisible network of giant triangles stretching from the southern tip of Cape Comorin to the silent, snow-covered heights of the north. The work of these surveyors was incredibly slow, systematic, and quiet, requiring immense patience and physical endurance. To obtain accurate measurements, the surveyors had to build tall, temporary stone towers on flat plains to raise their instruments above the shimmering heat haze of the ground. From the top of these silent towers, in the cool, clear air of dawn or dusk, they would peer through the telescope of the theodolite, aligning it with a distant signal light miles away. Each measurement was carefully noted down in leather-bound journals by the light of small oil lamps, their calculations filling thousands of pages with neat columns of numbers. Through this quiet, tireless application of trigonometry, the survey team slowly mapped the shape of the subcontinent, calculating the curvature of the Earth and eventually identifying the highest mountain peaks in the world, which had previously remained unmeasured and unnamed in their silent grandeur. As the surveyors worked to map the land, a different kind of quiet mapping was taking place along the coastlines of the Indian Ocean, where British marine biologists began studying the spectacular, hidden world of coral reefs. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, researchers established small, quiet marine stations on remote islands, such as the Maldives and the Cocos Keeling Islands. Armed with simple glass-bottomed wooden boxes and hand-cranked water pumps, these scientists spent long, peaceful days floating over the shallow, crystal-clear lagoons, observing the incredibly diverse ecosystems below. They documented the slow, rhythmic growth of brain coral, staghorn coral, and sea fans, which built massive underwater barriers over thousands of years. This quiet study of the oceans provided vital insights into the delicate balance of marine life, demonstrating how the smallest, microscopic organisms could create geological structures large enough to wreck the mightiest steel, STEAMSHIPS. This growing scientific curiosity also extended to the vast, ancient forests of India, where the colonial government established the Imperial Forest Department in 1864 to manage the extraction of valuable timber. Under the quiet, systematic leadership of Dietrich Brandis, a German-born botanist, the department introduced the principles of sustainable forestry to India. They created protected forest reserves, regulated the cutting of prized teak and deodar trees, and established quiet nurseries to replant cleared areas. Teak timber, known for its incredible durability and resistance to water, was highly valued for building the decks of the Royal Navy's warships and the sleepers of the rapidly expanding railway network. The daily routine of a forest officer was incredibly quiet and isolated, spent riding elephants through the deep, shaded canopies of the jungle, monitoring the growth of trees that would not reach maturity for another century to transport these massive teak logs from the deep interiors of the forests to the coastal ports. The foresters relied on a unique, quiet partnership with domesticated Asian elephants. For generations, local handlers, known as mahouts, had trained these magnificent, gentle giants to work in the woods. An elephant could navigate the steep, muddy slopes of the jungle with incredible agility, using its powerful trunk and tusks to lift, carry, and stack heavy logs with astonishing precision. The relationship between a mahout and his elephant was deeply personal and quiet, built on years of shared work, gentle spoken commands, and soft touches behind the elephant's large, sensitive ears. During the heat of the afternoon, the mahouts would lead their elephants to quiet, shaded rivers, where the animals would lie down in the cool water, closing their eyes in peaceful contentment, while the mahouts scrubbed their thick, gray skin with coconut husks, while elephants worked in the quiet jungles of the east. The dry, rocky landscapes of the Mediterranean were hosting a different kind of quiet, strategic development. On the island of Cyprus, which came under British administration in 1878, colonial officials focused on restoring the island's depleted water resources and agricultural productivity. The landscape had suffered from centuries of deforestation and soil erosion, leaving the central Mesoria plain dry and barren during the long, hot summer months. British engineers constructed a series of small, quiet earth dams and stone reservoirs to trap the winter rains, channeling the water through networks of clay pipes to irrigate citrus groves, olive orchards, and vineyards. This quiet transformation of the landscape brought a steady, peaceful prosperity to the rural villages, where the gentle sound of running water in irrigation channels became a comforting backdrop to the slow-paced, Mediterranean way of life. The agricultural success of Cyprus was mirrored by the quiet development of the island's historic lace-making industry in the mountain village of Lefkara. For centuries, the women of Lefkara had practiced a unique, highly intricate style of embroidery known as lefkaraika, which combined traditional Byzantine designs with Venetian patterns. The process was slow, rhythmic, and incredibly quiet, requiring hours of intense concentration as the women sat in the shaded, stone-paved courtyards of their homes, meticulously drawing threads and creating beautiful, geometric lace patterns on fine Irish linen. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, British tourists and merchants began buying this exquisite lace, introducing it to the fashionable parlors of London and Paris. The quiet, creative labor of these village women, passed down from mother to daughter over generations, became a proud symbol of Cypriot craftsmanship, connecting a remote mountain village to the global taste of the Edwardian elite. As we let these quiet images of surveyors measuring distant horizons, elephants bathing in shaded rivers, and lace makers working in quiet Mediterranean courtyards settle in our minds, we can feel the vastness and the deep, silent connections of this historical world. The night is still, the room is quiet, and the gentle, steady flow of history continues to carry you softly toward a deep, peaceful sleep. The global reach of the empire did not rely solely on heavy iron, canvas sails, or deep-water ports. Much of its expansion took place quietly in the gentle warmth of glass greenhouses and the damp, rich soils of botanical gardens scattered across distant hemispheres. At the heart of this green network sat the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in London. Under the high, arched glass of its grand palm house, botanists, gardeners, and explorers gathered to study, classify, and slowly redirect the living world. The plants that grew in these humid sanctuaries were not mere decorative curiosities. They were the quiet engines of global trade. From this central clearinghouse, living specimens were carefully packaged and sent on long, slow voyages across the oceans, forever altering the physical landscapes of entire continents. For centuries, Transporting delicate live plants across vast oceans was a nearly impossible task. The salty sea air, the lack of fresh water on deck, and the extreme changes in temperature meant that most specimens perished long before they reached their destinations. This botanical barrier was broken by a simple, elegant invention, the Wardian case, invented by a London physician named Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward in the late 1820s. The case was essentially an early terrarium-sealed wooden box fitted with glass panes. Inside this airtight environment, moisture transpired by the leaves condensed on the glass and trickled back down into the soil, creating a self-sustaining water cycle. Placed on the sunny decks of sailing ships, these miniature greenhouses protected rare ferns, delicate seedlings, and valuable crops from the harsh salt spray, while keeping them perfectly watered for months on end. This unassuming glass box quietly transformed the surface of the earth, breaking old agricultural monopolies and weaving a silent web of green connections. One of the first great botanical migrations facilitated by this invention was the movement of tea plants. In the mid-19th century, a botanist named Robert Fortune traveled deep into the interior of China, disguised in local dress, to collect secret specimens of Hikoalidae tea plants. Safely nestled inside rows of Wardian cases, over 20,000 tea seedlings made the long, arduous journey across the seas to the misty foothills of the Himalayas in India. In the cool, moist air of Assam and Darjeeling, these imported plants found a perfect home. Entire hillsides were slowly cleared and reshaped into orderly terraced green steppes. The quiet, rhythmic labor of plucking the delicate top to leaves and a bud became the heartbeat of these mountain communities, establishing a vast tea industry that soon supplied teacups from London to Melbourne. A similar, quiet revolution took place with the seeds of the Hevea brasiliensis, the wild rubber tree of the Amazon basin. For decades, Brazil held a tight monopoly on the production of natural rubber, a substance increasingly vital for the wheels, cables, and machinery of the industrial age. In the 1870s, Sir Henry Wickham gathered thousands of these precious seeds from the deep rainforests and shipped them directly to London, laid out on warm, damp fiber beds in the heated hothouses of Kew. The seeds germinated in the soft, gray light of the English capital. Once the young seedlings were strong enough, they were packed back into Wardian cases and shipped to the tropical, rain-soaked lands of Ceylon and Malaya in the Malay Peninsula. These imported trees flourished in the fertile red earth. A passionate botanist named Henry Ridley, who served as the director of the Singapore Botanic Gardens, spent years convincing local planters of the tree's immense value, often carrying rubber seeds in his pockets to distribute to anyone who would listen. Slowly, the dense, ancient rainforests of Malaya were replaced by vast, silent forests of planted rubber trees, standing in neat, endless, diagonal rows. The daily work on these plantations was marked by a quiet, meditative routine. Long before the morning sun broke through the canopy, workers walked from tree to tree, using a small, curved knife to make a delicate diagonal cut in the bark. This process, known as tapping, allowed the thick, milky white latex to drip slowly, drop by drop, into a half coconut shell bound to the trunk, collecting the raw material that would soon coat the electrical wires and bicycle tires of the modern world. The Green Network also sought to heal the very people who managed these sprawling territories. Malaria was a constant, invisible threat in the warm, humid climates of the tropics, claiming countless lives and halting the progress of railways, plantations, and roads. The only effective treatment of the era was quinine, a bitter compound extracted from the bark of the cinchona tree, which grew wild in the high, misty forests of the Andes, to secure a steady supply of this life-saving medicine. British explorers collected cinchona seedlings and transported them via Kew to the cool, high-altitude Nilgiri hills of southern India. There, extensive cinchona plantations were established, providing a reliable source of quinine that was processed into pills or dissolved in tonic water. This daily, bitter dose allowed workers and administrators to survive and labor in environments that had previously been considered too hazardous for long-term settlement. These botanical transfers created a unique, shared landscape across thousands of miles. A traveler walking through the botanical gardens of Peradeniya in Ceylon, the gardens of Calcutta in India, or the quiet paths of the Singapore Botanic Gardens would find the exact same species of palms, orchids, and ferns, all systematically arranged and labeled with their Latin binomial names. These gardens served as living libraries, where scientists spent quiet afternoons studying the growth habits of soil-enriching cover crops, testing new varieties of spices, and documenting the local flora. It was a slow, deliberate form of cultivation that transformed wild landscapes into highly organized, productive agricultural regions, shaping the economies and daily lives of millions of people who tended to these quiet, green migrations, leaving behind the quiet, green sanctuaries of our botanical gardens. We now turn our attention to the silent depths of the world's oceans, where a monumental network of copper and iron was being woven to connect the continents of the globe. In the mid-19th and early 20th centuries, the British Empire pioneered the installation of undersea telegraph cables, creating a global communications system known as the All-Red Line, because it touched down only on territories under British control. This invisible web of signals completely transformed the speed of human communication, allowing messages that once took months to travel by sailing ship to be transmitted in a matter of seconds. Yet, this great technological achievement took place in absolute silence, hidden deep beneath the ocean waves on the vast, dark plains of the seafloor. To construct this network, engineers had to design cables that could withstand the immense pressure, freezing temperatures, and salty corrosion of the deep ocean. The heart of the cable was a bundle of copper wires to carry the electrical signals, but the key to its success lay in its insulation. Botanists discovered that the milky sap of the gutta percha tree, native to the rainforests of Malaya, possessed unique properties. When heated, this natural rubber could be easily molded, but when cooled in water, it became incredibly tough, flexible, and completely waterproof. Millions of gutta percha trees were tapped in the quiet jungles of Southeast Asia to provide the insulating material that coated the copper wires. This core was then wrapped in layers of tarred hemp and heavily armored with spiraled iron wires to protect it from sharp rocks and marine organisms. The physical task of laying these cables across thousands of miles of open ocean was a slow, majestic operation requiring massive, specialized steamships. The most famous of these was the Great Eastern, a colossal iron vessel designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Inside the ship's cavernous hold, giant circular iron tanks held thousands of miles of heavy armored cable, coiled with meticulous care by teams of quiet laborers to prevent any tangles. As the ship glided slowly and quietly across the ocean, the cable was paid out over the stern, disappearing silently into the deep, dark water. Experienced engineers kept a constant, quiet watch on the tension of the cable, ensuring it settled gently onto the undulating valleys and peaks of the ocean bed without snapping. The quiet, rhythmic pulse of these cables was managed by small, isolated telegraph stations established on remote islands and coastal outposts around the globe. One of the most famous of these was the station at Bamfield, located in a quiet, rain-forested inlet on the rugged west coast of Vancouver Island in Canada. This station served as the eastern terminus of the Pacific Cable, which stretched over 4,000 miles across the vast, empty waters of the Pacific Ocean to Fanning Island, Fiji, and New Zealand. The operators who lived at Bamfield worked in a beautiful stone building surrounded by towering pine trees and the peaceful, misty air of the Canadian wilderness. Their daily lives were marked by a quiet, focused routine, reading the tiny, flickering reflections of light on mirror galvanometers to decode the Morse code signals coming from the deep sea on the other side of the Pacific. The cable emerged at Fanning Island, a tiny, remote coral atoll populated only by a handful of telegraph operators and coconut plantation workers, surrounded by the endless blue horizon of the Central Pacific and the quiet, rhythmic sound of waves breaking on the outer coral reef. These operators lived in profound isolation. The arrival of the supply ship once every few months was the only connection to the outside world. Yet, through the thin copper wire running under the ocean, they were in instant silent contact with the busy financial centers of London, New York, and Sydney. The quiet contrast between their physical isolation and their digital connection was a unique feature of life on these remote maritime outposts, where the vastness of the natural world met the microscopic currents of human thought. The installation of the submarine cables also required a quiet, ongoing effort to maintain and repair the network. If a cable was damaged by an undersea landslide, an earthquake, or a ship's anchor, specialized cable repair ships were dispatched to the location. The crew would use massive iron grapnels lowered to the sea floor to slowly and quietly sweep the bottom until they hooked the damaged line. Once retrieved, the cable was carefully brought to the surface, and highly skilled technicians working in quiet, onboard laboratories would splice the wires back together with surgical precision. This delicate, quiet work, often conducted in heavy seas and dense fog, ensured that the vital, flowing lines of global communication remained open, allowing the quiet pulse of the empire's business to beat steadily across the globe without interruption. As we let these quiet images of iron ships laying cables, remote telegraph stations surrounded by misty forests, and signals traveling silently through the deep ocean settle in our minds, we can feel the vastness and the deep, peaceful connections of this historical world. The room is quiet, the night is still, and the gentle, steady flow of history continues to carry you softly toward a deep, restful sleep. Our journey now takes us along the quiet, dusty roads and winding footpaths of the world to explore the silent, rhythmic network of the imperial postal system. In 1898, the British Empire introduced the imperial penny post, a revolutionary policy that allowed a simple letter to be sent from any post office in the United Kingdom to almost any territory within the empire for just one single penny. This quiet administrative decision sparked an unprecedented flow of written words across the oceans. Millions of letters, postcards, and small packages began to circulate around the globe, carrying family news, business agreements, and gentle greetings. This massive flow of paper was managed with absolute, quiet order, relying on the steady, daily labor of thousands of postal workers who sorted, stamped, and delivered the mail in every climate and terrain. At the heart of this network, in the rural districts of India, was one of the most unique and quiet transport systems of the era, the mail runners, known locally as the dak runners. In areas where the railway lines did not reach and the roads were too rugged for four-wheeled carriages, these dedicated men carried the mail on foot. A runner would secure a leather mail bag to the end of a long wooden staff, which was fitted with small brass bells that jingled softly as he moved. Jogging at a steady, rhythmic pace through the quiet, shaded forests and across the wide, sunny plains, the runner used the sound of the bells to warn villagers and travelers of his approach, ensuring the path was kept clear. The soft, metallic jingling of the brass bells was a comforting, familiar sound that echoed through the quiet countryside, representing the reliable, steady arrival of news from the wider world. The dak runners operated day and night, in monsoon rains and under the intense heat of the summer sun, showing incredible, quiet endurance. At regular intervals of a few miles, a runner would reach a small, quiet wayside post where another runner stood waiting. Without a word, the mailbag would be transferred, and the new runner would set off into the silent landscape, his bells jingling softly as he disappeared down the dusty path. This human relay chain kept the mail moving continuously across the vast distances of the subcontinent, bridging remote mountain villages and bustling coastal cities with a silent, unbroken stream of communication. The absolute dedication of these runners, who faced wild animals and flooded rivers in quiet solitude, ensured that the written word remained a powerful, binding force across the land. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the carriage of international mail was entrusted to the prestigious fleet of the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company. These grand steamships, proudly bearing the prefix RMS for Royal Mail Ship, operated on strict, quiet schedules that were coordinated with the arrival of postal trains at the docks of Southampton and Liverpool. Once the heavy leather mailbags were loaded into the ship's holds, the vessel would slip quietly out of the harbor, beginning its long, silent voyage across the dark ocean. Inside the ship, in quiet wood-paneled sorting rooms located deep below the decks, postal clerks worked tirelessly throughout the voyage. They stood before large racks of wooden pigeonholes, sorting thousands of letters by hand as the ship rolled gently on the ocean swells, ensuring that every piece of mail was organized and ready for immediate delivery the moment the ship docked in New York, Halifax, or Kingston in the quiet, rural villages of England. The local post office was the gentle focal point of community life, often housed in a small thatched roof cottage with a quiet garden of lavender and sweet peas. The post office was a place of slow, deliberate interactions. Inside, the air carried the comforting scent of beeswax, ink, and old paper. The sub-postmaster or postmistress would quietly weigh packages on heavy brass scales, cancel stamps with a rhythmic wooden thud, and place letters into neat wooden cubbyholes. Outside the door stood the iconic red cast-iron pillar box, designed with a quiet, solid dignity to protect the letters from the damp English weather. 4 generations of villagers, walking down the quiet lane to slide a letter into the narrow slot of the red pillar box, was a simple, comforting ritual that connected their quiet, rural lives to the global family of the empire. Further west, in the vast, snow-covered expanses of the Canadian prairies, the arrival of the mail was a highly anticipated event that broke the deep silence of the winter months. In remote settlements and isolated homesteads, where the winter wind swept across endless plains of white, the mail was delivered by horse-drawn sledges. The postman, wrapped in thick furs, would guide his team of horses through the silent, frozen landscape, the quiet jingle of the harness bells the only sound under the pale blue sky. The arrival of the mail sledge at a remote general store brought the community together in quiet warmth. Families would gather around the iron stove to read letters from relatives in Britain or Eastern Canada, their soft voices sharing news of distant births, marriages, and harvests, turning the lonely, silent winter into a shared, comforting experience, even in the dry, sun-baked interior of the Australian outback. The mail was delivered with quiet, heroic persistence. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, postal contractors used teams of camels to transport the mail over the trackless sand dunes and rocky gibber plains of the desert. These camels, managed by quiet Afghan handlers, could travel for days without water, carrying heavy bags of mail to remote telegraph stations, cattle properties, and mining camps. The slow, rhythmic sway of the camels as they walked in a silent line across the red earth under a hot, cloudless sky was a testament to human adaptability and quiet determination, ensuring that even the most isolated settlers remained connected to the global network of the written word. As we let these quiet images of mail runners jogging through shaded forests, steamships carrying letters across silent oceans, and red pillar boxes standing in quiet English lanes settle in our minds, we can feel the vastness and the deep, peaceful connections of this historical world. The night is still, the room is quiet, and the gentle, steady flow of history continues to carry you softly, restful sleep, leaving the slow swaying camel trains of the Australian interior behind. Our journey shifts to the tranquil, emerald waters of the South China Sea, where a quiet and highly specialized maritime community lived, worked, and slept on the water. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the British colony of Hong Kong was not just a bustling port of massive steel steamships. It was also home to tens of thousands of Tonka and Hoklo people, often referred to as the boat population. These families lived their entire lives aboard traditional wooden boats called sampans and junks, which were anchored in quiet, crowded flotillas in the sheltered bays of Aberdeen and Causeway Bay. For these communities, the water was a permanent, gentle home. The boats were kept with with every square inch of wooden deck serving a practical purpose. From drying salted fish in the warm sun to housing small clay cooking stoves that drifted sweet wood smoke into the evening air, the daily rhythm of the boat communities was quiet, peaceful, and deeply tied to the natural movements of the tides. While the grand merchant ships of the empire dominated the deep-water channels of Victoria Harbor, the wooden junks and smaller sampans navigated the quiet, shallow inlets, carrying passengers, fresh water, and local cargo from shore to ship. At night, as the busy lanterns of the city's waterfront began to flicker and glow against the dark water, the boat people would secure their vessels side by side in the sheltered typhoon shelters. The gentle, rhythmic rocking of the wooden hulls on the calm tide, accompanied by the soft lap of the water against the rudder and the distant, muffled sounds of the harbor, created a soothing, natural cradle. Families slept in small, covered cabins, protected by woven bamboo mats, completely insulated from the busy commercial world just a few hundred yards away on the stone docks. This maritime way of life was supported by the quiet, skilled work of traditional shipwrights who operated small, open-air boatyards along the shores of Apalacho Island. These craftsmen used ancient time-honored techniques to build and repair the wooden junks, working without blueprints or metal nails. Instead, they relied on hard, durable tropical timbers like teak and camphor wood, which were joined together with wooden dowels and sealed with a natural waterproof putty made from lime and wood oil. The sound of these shipwrights at work was slow and rhythmic, dominated by the quiet, steady scrape of hand planes smoothing the thick wooden planks and the soft tap of wooden mallets. The finished vessels, with their distinctive high-stern profiles and battened sails made of heavy canvas stiffened with teak, were perfectly adapted to the unpredictable winds and currents of the South China Sea, navigating the coastal waters with a quiet, majestic grace. To guide these wooden junks and larger international steamships safely into the harbor through the treacherous, rocky channels of the colony, the colonial government established a series of quiet, historic lighthouses. The most famous of these was the Cape Doggeler Lighthouse, built in 1875 on a rugged, wind-swept promontory at the southeastern entrance to Hong Kong Island, standing as a silent, white stone tower against the vast expanse of the open ocean. The lighthouse was staffed by dedicated keepers who lived in absolute, quiet isolation on the rocky cliffs. Their daily routine was slow and methodical, spent cleaning the heavy glass lenses, polishing the brass fixtures, and ensuring that the powerful light burned steadily through the thick sea fogs and torrential summer rains. The quiet, reliable sweep of the beacon across the dark, rolling waves provided a reassuring, silent guide to generations of mariners seeking the shelter of the harbor far to the west. Along the ancient, sun-baked caravan routes of the Middle East, the British were establishing a very different kind of quiet presence. In the years following the completion of the Suez Canal, the small, arid territory of Aden, located on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, became one of the most vital coal bunkering stations in the global imperial network. Aden was a landscape of dramatic, silent geology, built inside the crater of an extinct volcano that rose steeply from the blue waters of the Gulf of Aden. because of its dry, hot climate and lack of natural resources. The station relied entirely on the constant, quiet arrival of water-carrying vessels and cargo ships to sustain its population. Yet, despite its barren appearance, Aden was a crucial, silent turning point for global shipping, where every steamship traveling between Europe and Asia stopped to replenish its coal bunkers and receive fresh water. The coaling of these massive steamships was a monumental, highly organized operation that took place in the quiet, sheltered waters of Steamer Point. Hundreds of local laborers and immigrants from neighboring Yemen and Somaliland worked in quiet, coordinated teams, carrying heavy baskets of black Welsh coal from spacious shoreside depots onto the ships via long wooden gangplanks. This work, though physically demanding, was conducted with a rhythmic, quiet efficiency. The soft shuffle of bare feet on wood and the steady slide of coal into the ship's steel bunkers, creating a unique, industrial soundtrack that echoed across the water. Once the coaling was complete, the ship's decks were washed clean of coal dust, and the vessel would slip quietly out of the harbor, continuing its long, silent journey across the Indian Ocean, leaving Aden to return to its deep, sun-drenched silence under the hot Arabian sky. 2. Secure the fresh water needed for these visiting ships and the resident population. The British restored a series of spectacular, ancient stone reservoirs known as the Aden tanks, or the cisterns of Tavila. Originally carved into the solid volcanic rock of the mountain gorges by unknown builders centuries earlier, these massive interconnected playpools were designed to catch and store the rare, torrential rainstorms that occasionally swept over the peninsula. British engineers cleared away centuries of accumulated silt and repaired the stone walls, creating a beautiful, silent oasis of cool, deep water, nestled deep within the dry, red rock of the volcano. The absolute silence of these ancient stone chambers, where the only sound was the occasional, gentle drip of water reflecting against the high stone walls, offered a peaceful, cool sanctuary from the intense heat of the surrounding desert. As we let these quiet images of wooden sampans rocking gently on the tide, lighthouse beams cutting through coastal fogs, and cool stone reservoirs holding water in the heart of the desert settle in our minds, we can feel the vastness and the deep, silent connection of this historical world. The room is quiet, the night is still, and the gentle, steady flow of history continues to carry you softly toward a deep, peaceful sleep, leaving behind the sun-bleached stones of the Aden reservoirs. Our journey drifts southward across the warm, expansive waters of the Indian Ocean to a quiet, isolated volcanic island known as Mauritius, acquired by the British in the early 19th century. This peaceful island became one of the most important sugar-producing territories in the southern hemisphere. The landscape of Mauritius was defined by its dramatic, silent mountain peaks that rose sharply from fertile plains, covered in a vast emerald sea of sugarcane. The warm trade winds blew steadily across the island, causing the tall, leafy canes to sway with a gentle, whispering rustle that served as a constant, soothing backdrop to daily life. In the quiet coastal harbors, wooden sailing vessels and early steamships rested on the calm, turquoise waters, waiting to load the heavy sacks of sweet brown sugar destined for the markets of Europe. The heart of the island's agricultural success lay in the quiet, historic capital of Port Louis, which sat sheltered by a semicircle of dark basalt mountains. Along the stone waterfront, the daily routine of the port was slow and methodical. Clerks in lightweight linen suits worked in quiet stone-walled custom houses, recording the arrival of merchant ships and the weight of sugar cargoes in large, leather-bound ledgers. The air in the harbor was heavy and sweet, filled with the rich aroma of molasses, sea salt, and tropical flowers. Beyond the bustling docks, the residential streets of Port Louis were shaded by large banyan and flamboyant trees, their bright red blossoms casting cool, quiet shadows on the stone pavements, where residents walked slowly to escape the midday heat. A short distance from the capital lay the tranquil sanctuary of the Pamplemousses Botanical Garden, one of the oldest and most beautiful gardens in the southern hemisphere. Originally established as a private garden, it was quietly expanded under British administration into a world-renowned center of tropical botany. The jewel of the garden was the long, rectangular pond of giant water lilies, whose massive, circular leaves floated in absolute stillness on the dark water. These giant lilies, with their thick, upturned edges, could grow up to several feet in diameter, their pristine white and pink flowers opening slowly in the quiet warmth of the afternoon. Visitors and scientists walked along the shaded gravel paths in silent appreciation, surrounded by the gentle, rhythmic hum of tropical insects and the sweet, delicate fragrance of nutmeg, clove, and cinnamon trees that grew in quiet abundance throughout the grounds. This peaceful botanical environment was also a living laboratory for the study of soil chemistry and crop rotation, helping local farmers manage their land sustainably. The quiet work of the garden's botanists ensured that the island's soil remained rich and productive, preventing the erosion that had damaged other sugarcane growing regions. This scientific approach to agriculture brought a steady, peaceful stability to Mauritius, allowing generations of families to cultivate their small plots of land in harmony with the natural environment. The slow, predictable rhythms of planting, growing, and harvesting became a comforting pattern of life, deeply rooted in the fertile volcanic soil of this quiet island outpost. Now, we travel thousands of miles across the vast, blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean to the cool, misty coast of British Columbia on the western edge of Canada. The landscape here could not be more different from the tropical warmth of Mauritius, yet it possessed its own deep, majestic silence. The coast of British Columbia was characterized by endless, deep water fjords that carved their way into towering mountain ranges, covered in dense, ancient temperate rainforests of giant Douglas firs, Sitka spruces, and western red cedars. This damp, green wilderness was constantly bathed in thick, gray ocean mists that drifted silently through the high canopy of the trees, condensing on the soft mosses and dripping slowly and quietly onto the forest floor. The timber of British Columbia was an incredibly valuable resource, prized for its immense strength, straight grain, and natural resistance to decay. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, British logging companies established quiet, remote camps along the shores of these deep inlets to harvest the giant trees. The life of a coastal logger was marked by physically demanding work conducted in profound natural silence. The loggers used massive handsaws and heavy steel axes to fell the towering giants, their rhythmic, synchronized efforts echoing softly through the quiet woods. Once a tree was felled, it was carefully stripped of its branches and transported down to the quiet waters of the fjord. Using teams of heavy draft horses or steam-powered winches that operated with a steady, mechanical clatter in the distance. Once the massive logs reached the water, they were assembled into giant floating rafts known as log booms. These booms, consisting of thousands of logs bound together by heavy steel chains, were towed slowly and quietly down the protected waterways of the Strait of Georgia by sturdy steam tugs. The sight of these massive wooden rafts gliding silently across the glassy gray water, surrounded by the steep, snow-capped peaks of the coast mountains, was a testament to the scale of the natural world. The logs were brought to the bustling sawmills of Vancouver and New Westminster, where they were cut into high-quality timber for building ships, houses, and railway bridges across the global empire, connecting the silent, ancient forests of the Canadian wilderness to the rapidly growing cities of the modern world. The logging industry of British Columbia was supported by the quiet, dedicated work of forest rangers who lived in isolated cabins deep in the interior. These rangers patrolled the vast networks of mountain trails, monitoring forest health, watching for fires, and ensuring that timber harvesting was conducted in accordance with early conservation laws. Their lives were incredibly quiet and solitary, spent walking or riding through the cathedral-like silence of the ancient forests, where the only sounds were the soft crunch of pine needles underfoot and the occasional, distant cry of a bald eagle soaring high above the green canopy. This quiet guardianship helped protect the immense natural beauty of the Canadian wilderness, ensuring that the giant trees continued to grow and thrive in their silent, misty valleys for generations to come, as we let these quiet images of giant water lilies floating on silent ponds, emerald sugarcane fields rustling in the trade winds, and massive log booms gliding through misty northern fjords settle in our minds. We can feel the vastness and the deep, peaceful connections of this historical world. The night is still, the room is quiet, and the gentle, steady flow of history continues to carry you softly toward a deep, peaceful sleep from the misty fjords of the Canadian West. Our journey turns back toward the warm, tropical waters of Southeast Asia, settling in the quiet, sun-drenched Strait of Malacca. In the 19th century, this narrow strip of water became one of the most vital marine highways in the world, connecting the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. Along this historic shipping route lay the island of Penang, known to the British as Prince of Wales Island. Unlike the bustling commercial docks of Singapore further south, Penang retained a quiet, agrarian character, particularly in its lush, green interior. The British discovered that the island's rich, sandy soil and humid climate were ideal for the cultivation of valuable spices, which had been the source of global trade rivalry for centuries. They cleared small, quiet valleys to establish extensive nutmeg and clove plantations, filling the tropical air with a sweet, warm fragrance. The cultivation of nutmeg was a slow, delicate process that required infinite patience. The nutmeg trees grew quietly in the shade of larger jungle trees, taking several years to produce their first yellow pear-shaped fruits. When the fruit ripened, it split open naturally to reveal a dark brown nut wrapped in a bright crimson, lacy web known as mace. Local workers gathered the fallen fruits by hand, moving quietly through the shaded groves in the calm of the morning. They carefully separated the mace from the nut. As the spices dried, their colors softened and their rich aromatic oils concentrated. This quiet, gentle harvest was packed into small wooden boxes and loaded onto coastal sailing vessels, carrying the exotic scents of Penang's quiet hillsides to kitchens and apothecary shops across the globe to guide the growing number of merchant vessels safely through the treacherous, reef-strewn waters of the straits. The British constructed a series of spectacular, isolated lighthouses. The most famous of these was the Horsburgh Lighthouse, built in 1851 on a tiny, barren granite outcrop called Pedra Branca at the eastern entrance to the Singapore Strait. Designed by the quiet, brilliant government surveyor John Turnbull Thomson, the lighthouse was named in honor of James Horsburgh, the legendary hydrographer of the East India Company, whose charts had guided sailors through these waters for decades. The tower was constructed from heavy blocks of gray granite, quarried on a nearby island and transported to the reef by wooden barges. The stonemasons worked in quiet, rhythmic coordination, fitting the massive blocks together with absolute precision to withstand the powerful waves of the northeast monsoon. The life of the keepers stationed at Horsburgh Lighthouse was one of profound oceanic isolation, surrounded by an endless expanse of turquoise water and the quiet, rhythmic wash of the waves against the granite reef. They maintained a strict daily routine. Every evening, as the tropical sun sank below the flat horizon, the keepers climbed the winding spiral stairs to the lantern room to light the oil lamp. The heavy, polished glass lenses began their slow, silent rotation, casting a powerful beam of white light across the dark sea. This steady beacon served as a quiet, reassuring guide to captains of massive steamships and wooden Chinese junks alike, steering them safely away from the hidden rocks and into the deep water channels of the Singapore Strait. Maintaining a silent watch over the crossroads of the East, from these warm, tropical waters, we travel thousands of miles south to the cool, temperate landscapes of New Zealand's South Island, where a quiet agricultural revolution was unfolding on the vast Canterbury Plains, characterized by flat, open grasslands that stretched as far as the eye could see. The plains were framed by the majestic, snow-capped peaks of the southern Alps, rising silently in the western distance. In the mid-19th century, British settlers realized that these fertile, wind-swept plains were perfectly suited for sheep farming. They introduced thousands of merino and Corriedale sheep, which thrived on the nutritious native tussock grasses. The landscape, which had remained silent and untouched for centuries, became home to massive, quiet sheep stations, where the only sounds were the soft bleating of the flocks and the constant, whispering wind blowing down from the glaciers. The sheep industry in New Zealand initially focused on the production of high-quality wool, which was sheared by hand, pressed into heavy bales, and shipped to the textile mills of England. However, the true transformation of the New Zealand economy came in 1882 with the historic voyage of the sailing ship Dunedin, equipped with a pioneering Bell-Coleman cold air refrigeration machine. The Dunedin was loaded with thousands of frozen mutton carcasses at the quiet port of Port Chalmers. The ship's boilers powered the heavy mechanical compressor, which pumped cold air through the insulated wooden cargo holds, keeping the meat perfectly frozen. The Dunedin slipped quietly out of the harbor, beginning a long, silent 98-day voyage across the Pacific, around Cape Horn and up through the Atlantic to London. Arriving with its cargo in perfect condition, this quiet, technological triumph of refrigerated shipping, known as the reefer trade, completely changed the destiny of New Zealand. It allowed the isolated island nation to become the dairy and meat farm of the British Isles, establishing a steady, flowing pipeline of fresh food across the globe. Back on the Canterbury Plains, the daily routine of the shepherds took on a quiet, rhythmic pattern tied to the seasons. The shepherds, accompanied by their highly trained heading dogs and huntaways, spent long, solitary days on horseback, moving the large flocks across the rolling hills and river valleys. The relationship between the shepherd and his dogs was quiet and deeply intuitive, guided by short, soft whistles that echoed through the crisp mountain air, directing the dogs to gather the sheep with incredible, silent precision. In the quiet evenings, after a long day of mustering, the shepherds returned to their simple wooden homesteads, which sat nestled in the shelter of planted rows of tall pine and willow trees. Inside, the rooms were warmed by open stone fireplaces, where dry logs crackled softly, casting a warm, flickering glow on the wooden walls and simple wool carpets. The shepherds shared quiet meals of mutton, home-baked bread, and hot tea, talking softly about the health of the flocks, the quality of the pasture, and the approach of the winter snows. Outside, the vast Canterbury night was cold and clear, with the brilliant stars of the Southern Cross shining down in silent majesty over the sleeping sheep and the endless, dark plains, creating an atmosphere of profound, peaceful stillness. As we let these quiet images of fragrant nutmeg gardens in Penang, the steady sweep of the Horsburgh lighthouse beam, and the silent, starlit Canterbury Plains settle in our minds, we can feel the vastness and the deep, peaceful connections of this historical world. The night is still, the room is quiet, and the gentle, steady flow of history continues to carry you softly toward a deep, peaceful sleep. The transition from the cool, alpine pastures of New Zealand's South Island brings our journey to a series of isolated ocean lifelines, where the vastness of the sea was met by quiet, resilient communities. In 1856, the tiny Pacific outpost of Pitcairn Island, famous as the remote sanctuary for the descendants of the HMS Bounty mutineers, faced a quiet crisis of overpopulation. The island's limited soil and water could no longer sustain the growing community, leading the British administration to completely evacuate all 194 inhabitants to Norfolk Island, a fertile former penal colony thousands of miles to the west. While Norfolk offered spacious land and a peaceful climate, the deep, silent pull of their original home was too strong for some. Within a few years, several families quietly boarded passing vessels and returned to the rugged cliffs of Pitcairn, choosing a life of profound, quiet isolation over the comforts of a larger world. Farther west, in the warm, coral-fringed waters of the South Pacific, the quiet island of Niue became a British protectorate in 1900 after its local chiefs requested formal relations with the crown. The island, a massive, raised coral atoll known as the Rock of Polynesia, possessed no natural harbors. Its steep limestone cliffs rising sharply from the deep ocean. This unique geography kept life on the island remarkably quiet and self-contained, as local communities tended to their coconut groves and harvested wild yams in the shade of the dense inland forests. In the late 19th century, British traders visiting the nearby Cook Islands introduced specialized orange orchards to the volcanic hills of Rarotonga. The fertile soil and tropical rains allowed the orchards to flourish, turning the quiet, peaceful valleys into a major fruit exporting region that supplied fresh, sweet citrus to the growing cities of New Zealand. The safety of these expanding Pacific shipping lanes relied on the quiet, steady improvement of coastal navigation, which was transformed in 1909 by the construction of the Cape Brett Lighthouse on the rugged northern coast of New Zealand. Designed to guide ships navigating the turbulent entrance to the Bay of Islands. This remote tower was equipped with a revolutionary, cutting-edge mechanism, a heavy glass lens that floated and rotated within a circular bath of liquid mercury. This liquid cushion reduced friction to almost zero, allowing the massive lens to be turned smoothly by a simple, weight-driven clockwork motor. The lightkeepers lived in absolute, wind-swept solitude on the high cliffs, their quiet days spent polishing the brass fittings and monitoring the smooth, silent rotation of the beacon, which cast its reassuring light far across the dark, rolling waves of the Pacific. Meanwhile, in the vast, empty expanses of the South Atlantic, the remote island of St. Helena became the home of a highly specialized scientific station known as the Longwood Observatory. Originally famous as the site of Napoleon's final exile, the isolated volcanic island offered astronomers a unique, quiet vantage point, completely free from the light pollution of industrialized cities. In the mid-19th century, British scientists spent long, silent nights mapping the stars of the southern hemisphere and recording minute variations in the Earth's magnetic field. This slow, systematic work was conducted in absolute stillness, the researchers noting down their calculations by the soft light of oil lamps, while the wind whispered through the high cabbage trees outside, contributing vital data to the global study of navigation and terrestrial physics. The quiet, strategic value of these isolated South Atlantic outposts was further demonstrated by the official British annexation of the Tristan da Cunha Islands in 1816, situated midway between South Africa and South America. This tiny, active volcanic island was the most remote inhabited archipelago on Earth. The British garrisoned the island with a small detachment of Marines, primarily to prevent the French from using it as a base to launch a rescue mission for Napoleon on St. Helena, over 1,000 miles away. When the garrison was eventually withdrawn, a few sailors and settlers chose to remain, building a quiet, egalitarian community that lived by fishing, farming potatoes in small, stone-walled plots, and tending to communal flocks of sheep on the grassy slopes of the active volcano. Farther south, where the subantarctic winds swept continuously around the globe, British farmers in the cool, green valleys of the Falkland Islands faced incredibly harsh, wind-swept winters. To protect and feed their valuable sheep flocks during the freezing months, the settlers successfully introduced specialized nurseries to cultivate native tussock grass. This giant leafy grass, which grew in dense clumps along the rocky coastlines, was highly nutritious and resilient to the salty sea spray. The quiet work of planting and managing these green nurseries ensured the survival of the flocks, establishing a peaceful, pastoral way of life that thrived on the edge of the frozen southern oceans, where the quiet whistling of the wind was the only constant companion in the early 20th century. This southern scientific network expanded to the wild, uninhabited shores of Macquarie Island, situated in the stormy waters between Australia and Antarctica. In 1911, the Australian government established a quiet, high-latitude meteorological station on this narrow strip of wind-swept rock. The scientists stationed there lived in small, reinforced wooden huts, enduring freezing rain, snow, and relentless gales to collect essential weather data. By transmitting their daily barometric and temperature readings via wireless telegraphy, they provided the first reliable, early storm warnings for merchant ships navigating the treacherous trade routes of the Southern Ocean. Their quiet, solitary vigil in the frozen dark helped safeguard thousands of lives, demonstrating how the most desolate, silent corners of the globe were connected to the safety of the wider world, even in the warm, sunny waters of the western Atlantic. Innovative engineering was being used to protect shipping along the treacherous reefs of Bermuda. In 1846, the British constructed the historic Gibbs Hill Lighthouse on a high-lynn's southern coast. Unlike traditional stone lighthouses, which took years to construct, this majestic tower was built using prefabricated plates of cast iron, bolted together in neat circular rings. The iron plates were cast in England, shipped across the ocean, and assembled on-site with quiet, geometric precision. The resulting structure was incredibly strong yet elegant, standing as a silent, white sentinel that guided sailing ships safely through the jagged coral reefs of the Atlantic. Its steady light reflecting softly on the quiet, turquoise waters of the harbor below. As we let these quiet images of remote islands, lighthouse lenses floating on Mercury, and scientists mapping the southern stars in the dark settle in our minds, we can feel the vastness and the deep, peaceful connections of this historical world. The room is quiet, the night is still, and the gentle, steady flow of history continues to carry you softly toward a deep, restful sleep in the dry, sun-baked expanses of Northeast Africa. The late 19th century witnessed a quiet transformation as British engineers introduced innovative technologies to conquer the trackless desert. During the construction of the Sudan Military Railway in the late 1890s, the scorching heat made using draft animals virtually impossible over long distances. To solve this, engineers brought in massive steam-powered traction engines, colloquial road locomotives to haul heavy supply wagons across the shifting sands. These mechanical giants moved with a slow, heavy rhythm, their iron wheels crunching steadily over the dry gravel. The deep mechanical rumbling of the engines and the soft hiss of escaping steam became a familiar, comforting sound in the vast, silent desert, bridging the empty spaces between remote desert wells and the advancing railhead, where quiet workers laid iron tracks under the blazing sun to ensure safe passage for the steamships carrying these heavy materials toward the Suez Canal. British hydrographers undertook a meticulous effort to map the treacherous ancient coral reefs of Suakin. Located on the Red Sea coast of Sudan, Suakin was a historic Ottoman port built on a flat circular island connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway. The surrounding waters were a labyrinth of shallow reefs and sudden sandbars that could easily ground an unsuspecting vessel. British surveyors spent long, peaceful days rowing small wooden boats across the crystal-clear water, systematically dropping lead-weighted lines to measure the depth and charting the hidden contours of the coral below. Their quiet, methodical work produced highly accurate maritime charts, turning a notoriously dangerous passage into a safe, reliable channel where ships could glide peacefully through the calm blue waters of the Red Sea. Further inland, the tropical warmth of East Africa offered a very different landscape for scientific exploration and agricultural development. In 1898, the British established the quiet botanical gardens of Entebbe on the lush, green shores of Lake Victoria in Uganda. Situated just north of the equator, the gardens possessed a remarkably rich volcanic soil and a humid, temperate climate that was highly suited for experimental horticulture. Botanists at Entebbe spent quiet, peaceful decades importing and testing various economic plants from around the world, most notably Brazilian cocoa and rubber seedlings. They monitored the growth of these young plants in shaded, misty nurseries, studying how they adapted to the local soil and weather patterns. This slow, deliberate research laid the foundation for sustainable agriculture in the region, turning the gardens into a tranquil haven where scientists walked among towering palms and exotic ferns, listening to the soft rustle of leaves in the gentle lake breeze. This spirit of quiet, scientific investigation also extended to the Mediterranean, where British administrators on the historic island of Malta turned their attention to solving a persistent, centuries-old challenge, securing a reliable supply of fresh water. In the late 19th century, engineers and archaeologists systematically mapped the ancient subterranean Roman aqueducts and tunnels that ran deep beneath the historic city of Medina. These winding, stone-cut channels had been carved into the solid limestone of the island long ago, but had fallen into disrepair and silence. British workers slowly cleared away centuries of accumulated silt and mineral deposits, working by the soft, warm glow of lanterns in the cool, underground chambers. By restoring these ancient pathways, they successfully channeled clean, fresh spring water from the high hills down to the quiet public fountains of the villages below, bringing a steady, refreshing flow to the arid Maltese landscape. To further protect and manage the vital naval base at Malta, the Royal Navy utilized the spectacular, deep-water harbors of Valletta. The daily routine of the Mediterranean fleet was marked by a quiet, majestic precision, with massive steel battleships and cruisers anchored in neat, orderly lines within the grand harbor. Every morning, as the sun cast a warm, golden light over the honey-colored stone fortresses that lined the water, sailors performed their duties in quiet, coordinated unison. The soft, rhythmic creak of rowing boats carrying officers to the shore, the gentle clanking of anchor chains, and the distant, muffled chiming of church bells from the surrounding hills created a peaceful, harmonious soundtrack to life in the harbor, where the ancient stone walls stood as silent guardians of the sea. further west. At the very entrance to the Mediterranean Sea, a similar engineering project was underway within the towering limestone cliffs of the Rock of Gibraltar. To supply the vital military garrison and visiting warships with fresh water, engineers constructed a massive underground freshwater distillation plant deep inside the solid rock. They excavated cavernous chambers where large coal-fired boilers could heat seawater, condensing the steam into pure, clean drinking water that was stored in giant, dark reservoirs carved out of the mountain. This highly innovative system operated in the cool, silent depths of the rock, far removed from the busy harbor below. The slow, rhythmic hum of the condensers and the gentle, steady drip of distilled water into the deep stone basins created a soothing, echoing rhythm that highlighted the quiet ingenuity of the engineers who worked in the heart of the stone. The strategic network in the Mediterranean was completed by the quiet, picturesque island of Corfu, which remained under British protection from 1815 to 1864. The island was famous for its exceptionally beautiful landscape, characterized by rolling hills covered in ancient, silver-green olive groves that sloped gently down to the clear, blue waters of the Ionian Sea to house the High Commissioner. The British constructed the magnificent palace of St. Michael and St. George in the heart of Corfu town, built from warm, sport white Maltese limestone in an elegant, neoclassical style. The palace featured spacious, shaded colonnades and quiet, high-ceilinged reception rooms that looked out over the sea. In the quiet afternoons, the commissioner and his guests would walk through the shaded gardens, filled with aromatic citrus trees and blooming jasmine, enjoying the cool sea breeze and the absolute serenity of an island paradise. As we let these quiet images of steam, engines moving slowly across desert sands, ancient stone aqueducts restored to life, and neoclassical palaces looking out over the calm Mediterranean Sea settle in our minds, we can feel the vastness and the deep, peaceful connections of this historical world. The room is quiet, the night is still, and the gentle, steady flow of history continues to carry you softly toward a deep, restful sleep. The quiet expansion of global shipping and trade relied on the steady development of remote outposts, where the vastness of the wilderness met the quiet, structured organization of human industry. In the dense, ancient pine forests of New Brunswick, Canada, 19th-century lumbermen developed a highly innovative and quiet method for transporting heavy timber down to the sea. During the dry summer months, when rivers ran low, they constructed massive, temporary wooden structures known as splash dams across narrow creeks. These dams collected the slow trickle of forest water, creating quiet, deep reservoirs where thousands of heavy spruce logs were systematically gathered. When the spring thaws arrived, the lumbermen released the sluice gates, creating a sudden, powerful surge of water that floated the logs effortlessly down to the coastal sawmills. A quiet, seasonal rhythm that turned wild forest creeks into smooth, aquatic highways. Further south, along the eastern coast of Central America, the quiet, isolated settlement of Belize became the world's primary source of high-quality mahogany. This exceptionally strong, dark wood was highly prized in Britain for crafting elegant furniture and paneling the quiet libraries of grand country houses. Because the mahogany trees grew scattered deep within the dense tropical jungle, Finding and harvesting them required a quiet, highly skilled group of workers known as huntsmen. These men walked silently through the thick forest canopy, identifying the towering mahogany trees by the unique copper-red color of their leaves in the autumn breeze. Once felled, the massive trunks were dragged by teams of oxen along quiet, shaded trails to the nearest riverbank, where they were bound together into large wooden rafts and floated peacefully down to the coast on the gentle current to protect the valuable shipping fleets carrying these forest resources across the foggy, cold waters of the North Atlantic. The British constructed the historic Cape Spear Lighthouse in 1836, perched on a rugged, wind-swept cliff at the most easterly point of North America. This iconic stone tower stood as a silent sentinel at the entrance to the busy harbor of St. John's, Newfoundland. The lighthouse keepers lived a life of quiet, solitary vigilance, constantly polishing the heavy glass lenses and trimming the oil lamps to ensure the beacon pierced the thick, freezing sea mists. The steady, reliable sweep of the light-guided sailing ships, laden with dried cod and timber, safely away from the jagged coastal rocks, providing a reassuring, silent guide to mariners returning from the deep, lonely waters of the Atlantic fishing grounds in the warm, humid climate of the Caribbean. The quiet island of Montserrat developed its own unique agricultural specialty that connected it to the health of the global navy, while neighboring islands focused almost entirely on sugarcane. Montserrat's rich volcanic slopes were found to be ideal for cultivating lime orchards. In the mid-19th century, British entrepreneurs established extensive lime plantations across the island, harvesting the small green fruits to produce fresh juice. Because lime juice was rich in vitamin C, it was essential for preventing scurvy among sailors on long ocean voyages. The daily routine on the plantations was slow and peaceful, with workers gently plucking the ripe fruit and transporting it to quiet, stone-walled mills where the juice was extracted, bottled, and shipped to naval depots across the globe. A similar, quiet dedication to specialized agriculture took place in the cool, elevated valleys of the East Africa Protectorate in what is now Kenya. In the early 20th century, British settlers realized that the fertile red volcanic soil of the Limeroux Highlands, situated at an altitude of over 7,000 feet, was perfectly suited for growing tea. They cleared small, quiet plots of land to plant the delicate camellia seedlings, which thrived in the cool, misty air of the mountains. The daily work of tending to the tea gardens became a steady, peaceful routine, with local pickers moving quietly between the rows of emerald green bushes to harvest the tender top leaves, establishing a tranquil, high-altitude industry that soon supplied teacups around the world. The safety of these growing African trade routes was supported by the construction of the Cape Guardafui Lighthouse. Situated on the rugged desert cliffs of the Horn of Africa, known to ancient mariners as the Cape of Spices, this dry, isolated promontory was notorious for its violent currents, sudden dust storms, and hidden coral reefs. British and international engineers worked in quiet, challenging conditions to erect a sturdy stone tower that could withstand the intense heat and desert winds. The completed lighthouse was staffed by keepers who lived in profound, dusty isolation, their days marked by the quiet maintenance of the powerful lantern, the steady, reliable flash of the beacon across the dark, turbulent waters of the Gulf of Aden guided massive steamships safely around the rocky point, weaving a silent thread of safety through one of the most perilous passages on Earth. As we let these quiet images of floating timber rafts, lighthouse beams cutting through northern mists, and emerald tea bushes growing in high mountain valleys settle in our minds, we can feel the vastness and the deep, peaceful connections of this historical world. The room is quiet, the night is still, and the gentle, steady flow of history continues to carry you softly toward a deep, peaceful sleep, leaving behind the cool, high-altitude tea gardens of East Africa. Our journey moves to the legendary peaks of the Himalayas, where a quiet, scientific approach to nature was quietly taking root. In the 1840s, British botanists established the quiet Lloyd Botanic Garden in Darjeeling, a misty hill station nestled high in the mountains of West Bengal, created to preserve and study the rich alpine flora of the eastern Himalayas. The garden became a tranquil sanctuary of cobblestone paths, cool glass houses, and towering ancient trees. Botanists spent quiet, peaceful decades collecting and documenting rare Himalayan orchids, wild rhododendrons, and medicinal plants, sharing their discoveries with botanical institutions worldwide. The silent, daily work of tending to these delicate mountain plants, surrounded by the deep, cool mists rolling off the nearby glaciers, turned the garden into a peaceful haven where the only sound was the soft drip of condensation from the mossy leaves to transport the massive, high-quality timber harvested from these steep Himalayan mountain slopes down to the flat plains of northern India. Engineers developed a remarkably quiet and efficient system known as wet slides. These were long, elevated wooden flumes or troughs constructed along the edges of steep mountain gorges, constantly filled with a steady flow of rushing mountain water. Loggers would gently slide the heavy pine and cedar logs into the water-filled flumes, allowing the natural force of gravity and the slippery cushion of water to carry the massive timber effortlessly down the mountain at high speeds. This ingenious, quiet method of transport eliminated the need for heavy draft animals on the treacherous mountain paths, turning the roaring, dangerous gorges into smooth, silent pathways where timber glided peacefully down to the wide rivers below. Further south, in the steep, misty Nilgiri hills of Tamil Nadu, the British constructed a highly unique railway system to connect the hot, low-lying plains to the cool hill station of UTI, completed in 1899. The Nilgiri Mountain Railway utilized a specialized Swiss-designed rackhand pinion system to safely navigate the incredibly steep mountain gradients, which were far too steep for conventional locomotives. As the small steam train climbed slowly through the dense, green jungles and fragrant eucalyptus forests, a special cogwheel beneath the engine engaged with a central, toothed rack rail running between the tracks. The steady, mechanical clacking of the rackhand pinion system and the soft, rhythmic puff of steam from the locomotive created a comforting, predictable soundtrack that echoed gently through the deep mountain valleys, allowing travelers to ascend into the cool, quiet mountain air with absolute peace of mind, far across the warm, tropical waters of the Indian Ocean. British geologists in the early 20th century were conducting a very different kind of quiet exploration across the ancient, dry plains of Mesopotamia. They spent long, silent months mapping the vast, natural oil seeps that had bubbled quietly to the surface of the desert for thousands of years. Recognizing their immense value for the rapidly growing shipping fleets of the modern world, their methodical, quiet surveys of the desert terrain laid the essential groundwork for the subsequent construction of the historic Kirkuk to Haifa pipeline. This monumental engineering project eventually carried millions of barrels of crude oil across hundreds of miles of open desert, connecting the silent, ancient lands of Mesopotamia directly to the busy maritime ports of the Mediterranean Sea. The strategic administrative heart of this Middle Eastern shipping network was located in the quiet, historic Persian Gulf island of Bahrain. In the 19th century, the British established a political residency in a quiet, whitewashed stone compound in the bustling port of Manama. This quiet, administrative outpost became the central hub for managing the historic pearling treaties with the local rulers of the Trucial states, ensuring peace and stability across the warm, shallow waters of the Gulf. The British political agents lived a highly structured, quiet life within the cool, thick-walled compound, spending their days writing detailed reports in leather-bound ledgers and negotiating peaceful maritime agreements, while the soft, rhythmic chanting of local pearl divers echoed faintly across the harbor from their wooden dhows to protect the vital, global shipping lanes that connected these Persian Gulf outposts to the Suez Canal. The British constructed the lonely Daedalus Reef Lighthouse in 1863, situated on a tiny, isolated coral reef in the exact center of the Red Sea. Dozens of miles from the nearest coastline, this striking, octagonal iron tower stood as a completely isolated sentinel in the middle of the deep blue water. The lighthouse keepers lived in profound, oceanic solitude. Their small stone living quarters, built directly on top of the submerged coral reef, surrounded by an endless horizon of water and the constant, quiet wash of the waves against the iron pilings, they maintained a strict, daily routine of polishing the heavy brass fittings, cleaning the glass panels, and ensuring the powerful light flashed steadily through the dark desert nights, guiding massive steamships safely through the narrow Red Sea Channel. As we let these quiet images of orchids growing in misty Himalayan gardens, timber sliding smoothly down wet mountain flumes, and lonely lighthouses flashing in the middle of the dark sea settle in our minds, we can feel the vastness and the deep, peaceful connections of this historical world. The room is quiet, the night is still, and the gentle, steady flow of history continues to carry you softly toward a deep, peaceful sleep, leaving behind the isolated iron tower of the Daedalus Reef in the middle of the Red Sea. Our journey brings us to the quiet, sun-baked plains of Cyprus, a historic island situated at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Acquired by the British in the late 19th century, this peaceful Mediterranean island was home to a deeply rooted, agrarian way of life that was defined by its vast groves of carob trees. These ancient, hardy trees thrived in the dry, rocky soil of the island, producing large, dark brown pods that were known locally as black gold. The carobs were harvested entirely by hand during the quiet warmth of the late summer, with families moving slowly through the shaded groves to gather the fallen pods. Once dried in the warm sun, The Caribs were loaded onto wooden carts and transported to quiet, stone-walled warehouses along the coast of Limassol and Kyrenia, where they were crushed and shipped globally to make highly nutritious livestock feed, connecting the quiet, ancient hills of Cyprus to the agricultural markets of the wider world. Further east, in the hot, arid lands of the southern Arabian Peninsula, the British were establishing innovative engineering systems to sustain life in the vital, rocky port of Aden. Because of the territory's volcanic geology and lack of natural freshwater streams or reliable rainfall, securing drinking water for the growing population and visiting steamships was an ongoing challenge. To solve this, British engineers constructed massive coal-fired condensing machines along the sandy shores of the harbor. These complex industrial plants worked continuously and quietly, heating salt water from the sea to create clean steam, which was then condensed back into fresh, pure drinking water. The slow, rhythmic hum of these coastal condensers and the steady flow of distilled water into massive iron tanks created a reassuring, mechanical soundtrack that echoed softly across the quiet harbor, turning a barren, sun-bleached outpost into a reliable, refreshing oasis for global travelers. The strategic network in the Middle East was completed by the remote, rocky island of Perim, a small volcanic island situated in the narrow, turbulent waters of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the southern entrance to the Red Sea. In the late 19th century, the British established a quiet, highly strategic coaling station on this dry, wind-swept island to serve the rapidly growing number of steamships traveling through the newly opened Suez Canal. The island possessed a small, natural harbor where heavy coal-carrying barges rested on the calm, blue water. A small, dedicated community of telegraph operators, lighthouse keepers, and coal workers lived in absolute, dusty isolation on the barren rock, their daily lives marked by the quiet, methodical work of replenishing the bunkers of passing vessels. This silent, essential outpost served as a vital, reassuring checkpoint, ensuring that the flowing lines of global commerce could navigate the narrow gateway of the Red Sea with absolute safety and precision. Further east, where the warm waters of the Indian Ocean met the Pacific, we return to the island of Singapore, which had been established in 1819 by Sir Stamford Raffles. Unlike other European trading ports of the era, which charged heavy duties on goods passing through their harbors, Singapore was declared a completely free port from its very inception. This quiet, revolutionary administrative policy allowed merchant ships of all nations to trade, load, and unload their cargoes without paying any customs, taxes, or fees. This lack of financial friction turned the quiet, mangrove-fringed harbor into an incredibly popular and peaceful meeting place for global commerce. Wooden Chinese junks, sturdy Bugis schooners, and massive British steamships anchored side by side in the calm, deep-water channels, exchanging spices, silks, and manufactured goods in a quiet, harmonious flow of international trade that transformed the island into the true crossroads of the East. In the cool, elevated mountain ranges of Burma, the British established a very different kind of sanctuary to escape the intense, tropical heat of the lowlands. Nestled in the Shan Hills, at an altitude of over 3,000 feet, the quiet hill station of Memo became a peaceful retreat characterized by its cool, fresh mountain air and lush, green landscapes. The town was designed with spacious, winding lanes shaded by tall pine trees and eucalyptus groves, where residents built simple, timber-framed houses surrounded by beautiful, English-style country gardens. In these shaded, damp plots of fertile mountain soil, gardeners successfully cultivated English strawberries, delicate sweet peas, and vibrant roses, which bloomed in quiet abundance throughout the year. The slow, peaceful routine of tending to these gardens, accompanied by the gentle rustle of pine needles in the cool mountain breeze, offered a tranquil, comforting sanctuary that felt worlds away from the busy, humid valleys below. The safety of these Burmese trade routes was supported by the construction of the massive Al-Guada Reef Lighthouse, situated on a highly dangerous, submerged granite reef in the muddy, shifting delta of the Irrawaddy River, designed by the brilliant engineer Alexander Fraser and completed in 1865. The lighthouse was carved from heavy blocks of gray granite, which were quarried on a distant island and transported to the reef on wooden barges. The stonemasons worked in quiet, highly coordinated teams, fitting the massive blocks together with absolute geometric precision to withstand the powerful waves and shifting currents of the Bay of Bengal. The completed tower stood as a majestic, silent monument in the middle of the shallow sea, staffed by keepers who lived a life of profound oceanic solitude. The steady, reassuring flash of the beacon across the dark, turbulent waters guided ships safely around the hidden reef, completing the final link in our global network of safety and connection. As we let these final, quiet images of carob harvests on the sunny hills of Cyprus, fresh water condensing on the shores of Aden, and the steady flash of the Al-Guada Reef Lighthouse settle in our minds, we can feel the vastness and the deep, peaceful connections of this historical world. The 100 facts are now complete, and the long global journey has come to its quiet, restful end. The room is quiet, the night is still, and the gentle, steady flow of history continues to carry you softly toward a deep, peaceful sleep.